Near the dim hum of a flickering hallway lamp, Frances Farmer once stood motionless, her shadow stretched long across the cold hospital floor. In that stillness, her name drifted through whispered corridors, half myth, half warning, as if the walls themselves carried memories of a brilliance the world could not bear. Welcome, dear listener. Share where and when you join this wandering circle of remembrance, and let your voice become part of our quiet constellation. And if these stories bring you comfort, please subscribe to support this journey tonight gently. Tonight gently becomes the doorway into an older world, where the quiet glow of distant decades settles like dust upon a forgotten photograph, and the life of Frances Farmer begins to take shape beneath that muted light. It is here, in this soft threshold between memory and oblivion, that we step into the era that formed her, an age when Hollywood was young yet already hardened, a place that wore its dreams like costumes while hiding its machinery behind locked doors. The world she entered was shimmering on the surface, but its shimmer carried the weight of expectation, the kind that pressed upon each hopeful face with invisible hands. Beneath the glamour, there was a rhythm that pulsed steadily, demanding obedience from those who wished to belong. And perhaps, even before she arrived, Frances walked in counterstep to that rhythm, guided by a different tune that rose quietly from within her, as if she belonged to some older, more restless lineage of wandering spirits who refused the comfort of conformity. In those early years, the nation itself was shifting like a restless sleeper. The Great Depression had carved deep lines into everyday life, yet Hollywood projected images of perfection, inviting the public to escape into stories brighter than their own. The studios stood like citadels of illusion, built upon dreams but guarded with iron discipline. Young actors were taught to smile a certain way, speak with measured cadence, and reveal nothing that might disrupt the ideal. But what happens, one wonders, when a person arrives who has no interest in polishing away her rough edges? What happens when her truth is too sharp, too unfiltered to be molded cleanly into the shapes the industry prefers? Even before Frances's name appeared on marquees, there was a sense that she was not merely another face to be sculpted. She carried with her a presence that did not ask permission, a presence that turned both admiration and suspicion toward her in equal measure. To understand the path her life would take, one must first linger in this broader landscape, for it shaped the pressures that gathered around her like weather. Actors who followed the rules found success. Those who questioned them were quietly corrected, or, when necessary, removed. The public demanded beauty and gentle mystery, and the studios complied by crafting larger-than-life personas that bore little resemblance to the real human beings beneath their painted surfaces. Into this carefully regulated environment stepped Frances Farmer, whose intellect was known to those around her long before her talent reached the screen, and whose independence was both her compass and her undoing. She approached the world not with calculated charm, but with an inquisitive fire that could not be easily cooled. And such fire, in a place built of paper scenery and fragile illusions, was bound eventually to ignite something. Yet in these early impressions of her age, we also glimpsed the delicate tensions that would follow her everywhere. Hollywood was a world hungry for stars, yet fearful of minds it could not tame. It was a realm where success required a delicate balance between self-expression and surrender. One had to know when to shine brightly and when to dim at the studio's command. Frances, however, seemed to shine according to her own seasons, as if governed by a sunset no one else could see. People who encountered her often felt they were meeting someone who lived slightly out of step with the moment, as though she carried echoes of something ancient, something that resisted the simple boundaries she was asked to accept. And perhaps this is why so many later misread her, mistook her quiet refusals for rebellion and her convictions for arrogance. What if she was simply unwilling to pretend? In this period, Hollywood studios were building their legends with speed and precision. Each new film was crafted to promise escape, and each new star was shaped to deliver that promise. Training schools taught posture, etiquette, diction. Publicists shaped stories that would charm the nation. Photographers learned to capture only the most flattering angles, while rumors were buried beneath carefully worded statements. The industry ran like a vast clockwork, every gear polished, every motion deliberate. It was a place where truth was malleable and image was everything. Against such a backdrop, the arrival of someone unbending, unyielding, and uninterested in pretense was more than uncommon. It was inconvenient, and perhaps that inconvenience was noticed long before anyone dared to speak it aloud. Even as Frances began to step toward the fame waiting ahead of her, the air around her shimmered with this early tension. She moved through the world with a kind of restless certainty, driven by something interior rather than exterior. Her mind was sharp, her emotions strong, her judgments unwavering. She questioned authority where others bowed to it, and she carried herself with a mixture of grace and defiance that caught the attention of anyone watching. One might imagine her walking through the studio grounds for the first time, observing the painted facades and bustling crews with the eyes of someone who sees through the surface of things. Did she sense already that this place would become both her stage and her battleground? Or did she, like so many young dreamers, hope she could hold her truth intact against the pressures that would come? As we look upon this moment in her life, the first quiet step before the storm, it becomes clear that her story cannot be told without first understanding the world she was stepping into. It was a place that rewarded charm, compliance, and predictability. Frances embodied none of these fully. Instead, she brought intensity, independence, and an uncompromising sense of self. Traits admired in artists, yes, but risky in an industry governed by contracts and expectations. And so, the early groundwork of conflict was laid not by any single event, but by the collision of two natures. On one side, a system built to contain; on the other, a spirit built to wander. Thus, the lantern light of this opening part flickers over a time of illusion and rigidity, a time when the world was hungry for heroes, yet uncertain how to handle those who would not be shaped into neat forms. Frances would soon enter this world more fully, her steps echoing through studio hallways, her face beginning to appear on screens, her voice carried through theaters. But in this moment she is still approaching, still gathering the quiet momentum that precedes her rise. The question that hangs gently in the air is simple yet heavy. Did Hollywood know from the very first moment that she would not bend? Or did the truth dawn only later, like a slow vibration in the machinery of a dream-making empire? Somewhere in the distance, a faint echo lingers, as though a photograph bulb is still fading, slowly surrendering its glow to the dark. The fading glow of that imagined photograph settles into silence, and from that silence rises the first breath of Frances Farmer's beginnings, far from Hollywood's glittering facades, in the mist-laden city of Seattle, where the northern winds pressed gently against the rooftops and the sea carried a scent of distance. It was in such a landscape, half rugged, half dreaming, that Frances was shaped, not by studios or agents or publicists, but by the untamed temperament of the Pacific Northwest. Her childhood unfolded beneath gray skies and shifting weather, within a home governed by a mother's fierce expectations and a daughter's equally fierce inwardness. She was not born into privilege or into poverty. She was born into a space where intellect and discipline were prized, but so were appearances, and this balance would one day echo through every chapter of her life. Even as a young girl, she looked upon the world with a gaze slightly sharper than those around her. Teachers noticed it. Classmates felt it. She seemed to listen to the world with an intensity that made others quietly cautious, as if she were cataloging truths they themselves had overlooked. Seattle in the early 20th century was a place of both grit and possibility. its docks filled with workers whose faces bore the strain of long hours, while its hills were dotted with homes whose occupants dreamed of safer, quieter futures. Frances moved between these contrasts with an ease that suggested she belonged not fully to either world. Her father, calm and steady, provided her a refuge of sorts, though his quietness sometimes collided with her mother's more commanding presence. Her mother, determined and formidable, believed deeply in achievement, in propriety, in the value of being perceived as respectable. Perhaps this belief was born from her own struggles. Perhaps it was shaped by the era itself. But whatever its origin, it met with an unexpected resistance in Frances, whose emerging sense of self valued something different. Truth over decorum, curiosity over obedience, expression over silence. The tension between them did not erupt into dramatic battles in these early years, but rather simmered as a subtle undercurrent, one that would one day swell with great force. As she grew into adolescence, Frances discovered books with the same enthusiasm others might discover friendships. She read voraciously, searching for meaning in stories that spoke of rebellion, philosophy, and the intricate workings of the human mind. She wrote with passion, her words carrying a weight that set her apart from her peers. At school, some admired her, others felt uneasy in her presence. She was brilliant, yes, but she was also unpredictable in thought, unwilling to say what others expected. She questioned authority with a calm boldness that startled adults. In class discussions, she spoke not simply to answer, but to provoke deeper reflection, as though she had no interest in being applauded, only understood. And yet, how many understood her even then? How many could see the complexity of a young girl whose mind stretched beyond the boundaries of her world? One of the defining moments of her youth came with her controversial essay, published during her time at school, in which she challenged widely held beliefs with a clarity and defiance far beyond her years. Some called her courageous, others called her dangerous. Both labels clung to her for the rest of her life, and perhaps neither was entirely accurate. She was simply unafraid of asking questions that others preferred to ignore. But in a society governed by tradition, such fearlessness was often mistaken for rebellion. It is tempting to ask, did Frances write from conviction, or did she write because she sensed instinctively that the world needed to be unsettled now and then? Or perhaps she wrote simply because she could not help herself, that her mind, restless as the tides of Puget Sound, needed space to wander without constraint. Her intellectual pursuits did not make her aloof. She was not cold or unreachable. She felt deeply, sometimes too deeply, about justice, about integrity, about the possibility of a life lived authentically. When she discovered theater, she found a perfect channel for that depth. The stage allowed her to explore emotions that words alone could not capture. In school productions, she revealed a presence that startled teachers and classmates alike. She did not simply recite lines, she inhabited them. Her performances carried a rawness that hinted at the extraordinary potential within her. And yet, even then, she remained wary of artifice. Acting, to her, was not about pretending. It was about telling emotional truths that society often preferred to keep hidden. This tension between authenticity and performance would follow her, haunting her rise and shadowing her collapse. At home, her relationship with her mother grew increasingly strained as Frances matured. Her mother admired her talent but feared her boldness, sensing perhaps that it would lead her into worlds too vast and too dangerous to control. Frances, meanwhile, began to chafe against any attempt to shape her future. She longed for independence, not in frivolous ways, but in the deep sense of wishing to choose her own path, her own beliefs, her own identity. The more she grew, the more it became clear that she was not simply another young girl dreaming of stardom or success. She was a person driven by an unyielding internal compass, one that pointed toward truth, even when truth was uncomfortable. When she reached young adulthood, she entered the University of Washington, where her artistic and intellectual energies expanded into new forms. She joined the drama department, where directors and fellow students alike observed her with a mixture of admiration and fascination. Her performances were striking not because she tried to impress, but because she approached each role as if it were a question to be answered. She was not interested in applause. She was interested in meaning, and meaning for Frances was never simple. Her beauty, though undeniable, was overshadowed by this intensity, leaving some drawn to her and others intimidated. It was here, within the buzzing energy of the university, that she first caught the attention of professionals who believed she could one day rise far beyond local stages. But alongside her blossoming talent, the early shadows of future conflict began to form. Frances was outspoken in her beliefs, unafraid to speak publicly on issues of social justice, sometimes in ways that stirred controversy. Her writing continued to challenge norms. Her refusal to soften her opinions caused some to whisper that she was difficult, unstable, too bold. Perhaps she sensed even then that society dislikes the woman who thinks too sharply, who refuses to mask her intelligence behind a comfortable smile. Or perhaps she simply lived according to her nature, unconcerned with how the world perceived her. By the time she won a local theater competition that would soon guide her to broader horizons, the winds of her destiny had already begun to shift. She stood at the edge of two worlds, the familiar safety of Seattle and the vast unknown of a career not yet fully imagined. There was promise, certainly. There was excitement. But there was also a quiet tension beneath the surface, a sense that her life would be shaped not only by her talent, but by the conflicts between who she was and what the world expected her to be. And so, as she stepped toward the opportunities that awaited her, a faint sound lingered behind her, the soft rumble of a train preparing to depart, carrying her away from the northern city that had formed her spirit. The soft rumble of that departing train settles into the air, carrying with it the weight of all that Frances was leaving behind. And as it fades, a new landscape emerges before her, one lined with possibilities she had not yet dared to fully name. Her journey toward Hollywood did not begin with an explosion of ambition or a sudden revelation of destiny, but with a quiet current, a series of small choices and opportunities that drew her gradually toward a world both alluring and perilous. When she first arrived in California, the warm light must have felt unnervingly gentle compared to the shifting skies of Seattle. Yet beneath its brightness lay a hum, a pulse of expectation, a whisper that newcomers were meant to bend, to fit, to become something other than what they had been. Frances stepped into this new world with the same directness she had always carried, her spirit unsoftened, her convictions unaltered. In that simple steadfastness lay the first fracture in the mirror-like surface of Hollywood's carefully constructed harmony. What struck many about Frances in those early days was her presence. She did not arrive timidly, nor did she arrive with arrogance. She walked as though she belonged to herself, not to the industry she was entering. Casting directors noticed this immediately. Her talent was apparent, her beauty undeniable, but it was her intensity, a kind of inward fire that set her apart. She did not perform for approval. She performed as though she were wrestling with something deeper, something unnamed. This unsettled some, intrigued others, and signaled to a few astute observers that she might someday become a formidable force in theater and film. But Hollywood was not a place that welcomed such forces easily. It preferred malleability, the sort of young star who could be shaped, coached, and guided with steady hands. Frances even then did not lend herself easily to shaping. Her first encounters with the studio system introduced her to rules, spoken and unspoken, rules that governed everything from how to speak to how to smile, from what to reveal to what to hide. She found herself in meetings where producers discussed her as though she were a material to be polished, a commodity to be sculpted. They saw the potential for marketability, for rising fame, for box office returns. Yet they also sensed a resistance in her, a reluctance to surrender her identity in exchange for opportunity. To some, this made her fascinating. To others, it made her troublesome. She was offered roles, contracts, publicity coaching, and though she accepted many of these opportunities with professional grace, she did so without surrendering the core of who she was. At times, she questioned the scripts placed before her, asking why certain characters behaved in ways that felt false. She challenged promotional narratives. She resisted the suggestion that she soften her opinions or conceal her intelligence to appear more appealing to audiences. These early resistances were not dramatic confrontations. They were subtle, almost invisible gestures. A lifted eyebrow, a carefully worded hesitation, a refusal to nod along with the coercive enthusiasm of studio executives. But in an environment where conformity was the quiet expectation, such gestures carried weight. And weight, when too often ignored, eventually presses hard enough to crack something. Frances likely did not sense how fragile the balance truly was, how easily a reputation could be shaped by whispers, how quickly the label of difficult could cling to a person who simply did not bend. There were moments in those early days when she must have felt herself standing at a threshold, caught between the promise of a career and the preservation of her autonomy. Some of her colleagues warned her gently, "Do not question too much. Do not reveal too much. Do not confront the invisible boundaries that shaped the industry." She listened, perhaps even tried to adapt, but the truth of her spirit was too deeply rooted to be trimmed back into the acceptable shape of a young Hollywood hopeful. She was polite, professional, even earnest, but she was not compliant in the way the system required, and that quiet refusal began to ripple through the corridors long before she understood the consequences it might carry. One of the first signs of the turning point was a seemingly insignificant conversation. Frances had been asked to adjust her public persona to appear more lighthearted, less intellectual. The suggestion was offered kindly, with the tone of guidance rather than correction. Yet something in her resisted. She asked why she should pretend to be someone she was not. The room grew tense, though no argument followed. That moment, small, almost invisible, would echo in her later years when people looked back and tried to pinpoint when the friction began. The truth is that the friction was not a single event, but a gradual accumulation of such moments, each one widening the quiet divide between Frances and the world she was entering. The more she worked, the more she realized that Hollywood valued predictability. Interviews were rehearsed, photographs were staged, personal stories were crafted to appear charming but harmless. Frances, however, found the notion of presenting a diluted version of herself unsettling. She hesitated during interviews, sometimes refusing to answer questions she felt were trivial or misleading. She spoke sincerely when sincerity was not expected. And in her sincerity, she unintentionally revealed the fragility of the illusion that held the industry together. There was also the matter of her temperament. Not the volatile outbursts that later headlines sensationalized, but the earlier signs of a woman who felt deeply, questioned often, and refused to accept easy answers. She carried herself with a seriousness that some mistook for aloofness. She had moments of quiet irritation when confronted with superficial demands. She disliked pretension, particularly when it was wielded as a tool of manipulation. She was, in essence, honest in a place that relied heavily on disguise. And honesty, especially a sharp and unfiltered honesty, has a way of making the powerful uneasy. As her early work gained modest attention, a subtle tension began to grow around her. There were murmurs that she was brilliant but unpredictable, talented but too headstrong. Sometimes her colleagues admired her courage. Other times they shook their heads quietly, worrying she would not last long if she continued to challenge the industry's unspoken rules. Yet Frances moved forward unaware of how closely she was being observed and how her refusal to conform was quietly shaping her future. Perhaps the clearest symbol of this turning point was the moment she first walked alone across a deserted studio lot late in the evening, the empty sound stages towering around her like silent witnesses. The air was still, the lights dimmed, and she moved with the uneasy sense of being both inside a dream and outside of something essential. The shadows cast by the buildings seemed to lengthen behind her as though reaching out, reminding her gently, or perhaps warning her, that this world required a kind of surrender she was not prepared to give. And as she stepped into the darkened corridor leading toward the dressing rooms, she paused for just a moment, sensing something unspoken, an invisible pressure gathering, a faint tremor in the air, as if the studio machinery were shifting ever so slightly in response to her presence. Somewhere, behind a closed door, a whisper rose, too faint to catch, but unmistakably carrying her name. The faint whisper carrying her name dissolves into the night. And as dawn rises over the studio lots, Frances steps into the next stretch of her journey, unaware that the early tremors beneath her feet are slowly gathering strength. Hollywood's mornings often began with a deceptive softness, sunlight washing over the facades of buildings that held both promise and illusion. For Frances, this new day marked the beginning of her ascent, a rise shaped not merely by beauty or ambition, but by the force of her performances, which struck observers with a clarity that hovered somewhere between art and confession. She did not approach acting as a task or a stepping stone. She approached it as a form of searching. Each role, even the smallest, became a window into emotions too complex to articulate in daily life. Directors who worked with her in these early years found themselves watching in quiet fascination as she tapped into a reservoir of feeling that seemed far deeper than her experience should permit. There was a rawness to her portrayal of sorrow, a sharpness to her expression of anger, a quiet but piercing vulnerability that appeared unbidden, as though drawn from unseen depths. Her rise was not explosive. It moved like a steady flame, building slowly, illuminating the edges of her talent before revealing its full heat. She was cast in films that allowed her range to unfold, in scenes that demanded not theatricality, but truth. Audiences began to notice the difference. There was something authentic about Frances, something that set her apart from other rising stars whose performances often shimmered with polish, but lacked rootedness. Her acting carried a certain gravity, an unforced honesty that could not be replicated through training alone. Yet, even as she gained attention for her artistry, a subtle countercurrent developed. Some in the industry admired her depth. Others viewed it with caution, for depth is unpredictable. Depth resists control. Behind the scenes, the studios attempted to mold her into a marketable figure. Publicists urged her to soften her edges, to smile more readily in photographs, to offer charming, digestible anecdotes in interviews. But Frances resisted these gentle pressures. She responded thoughtfully, rather than lightly. She refused to recite rehearsed lines crafted to make her more appealing. She spoke candidly about the art of performance, about society, about the constraints she observed around her. These responses unsettled some executives who preferred their actresses luminous but simple, presentable but uncontroversial. Still, they tolerated her difference because her talent generated interest, and interest, after all, meant revenue. As her film appearances increased, so did the quiet fascination surrounding her. Fellow actors described her as both warm and distant, capable of intense connection on screen but often lost in her own thoughts when the cameras stopped. She was not unkind. She did not withdraw out of arrogance. She simply moved through the world with an inwardness that others sometimes mistaken for aloofness. There were evenings when she attended studio gatherings but lingered at the edges of the room, observing the conversations around her without fully participating. She seemed to sense the artifice in such gatherings, the rehearsed charm, the hidden agendas cloaked in compliments. And in sensing these things, she quietly distanced herself, not in dramatic fashion, but with the gentle firmness of someone who recognized that her integrity required space. Rumors began to form around her, not yet sharp or cruel, but inquisitive. Some whispered that she was too intense for Hollywood, that she thought too deeply, questioned too freely. Others said she was destined for greatness, though perhaps not the kind Hollywood recognized. These whispers coexisted uneasily, shaping her reputation in ways she did not fully understand. She continued to work, learning not only the craft of performance, but the machinery of the industry. She watched how roles were distributed, how publicity was crafted, how narratives were shaped to captivate audiences. And the more she observed, the more she sensed a subtle dissonance between the image Hollywood built and the truth it strained to conceal. There were days when she felt the exhilaration of success, when stepping onto a film set felt like stepping into a space where she could express emotions too layered to be spoken. Her performances resonated with a sincerity that captivated crew members who paused their work just to watch her inhabit a character. Yet there were also days when the demands of the studio weighed heavily on her shoulders. She was asked repeatedly to soften her presence, to appear more demure, more light-hearted, less opinionated. These suggestions, offered gently but persistently, felt like threads being pulled from the fabric of who she truly was. Frances smiled politely, nodded when necessary, but the deeper part of her resisted quietly, refusing to let herself be carved into a shape that did not belong to her. As her public profile grew, so did the pressure to maintain an image that matched the industry's expectations. Photographers asked her to tilt her head a certain way, to feign a lightness she did not feel, to present a carefully curated version of herself that bore little resemblance to the woman she was. At first, she complied out of professional courtesy, but gradually her discomfort became more visible. She challenged magazine writers who fabricated details about her life, corrected interviewers who attempted to steer her into shallow conversations, and declined invitations to events that seemed designed more to display her than to honor her work. Her colleagues admired her strength, though many feared it would cost her dearly. And indeed, her resistance began to attract unwanted notice from the studios. Executives who once saw her as a rising asset now regarded her unpredictability with suspicion. They preferred stars who surrendered easily, who moved through the system like channeled water rather than uncontained currents. But Frances was not a vessel. She was the current itself. At the height of her early rise, she took on roles that demanded exceptional emotional range. Her performances left audiences unsettled, moved, or strangely contemplative. Critics noted her ability to inhabit characters with a startling honesty, as though she was drawing from private truths too heavy to speak aloud. This rawness set her apart, but it also raised questions. How did she access such depths? What did she draw upon? And did the industry, so hungry for authenticity on screen, truly understand the cost of pulling such sincerity from a person who was already wrestling with internal storms? At times, the intensity of her work seemed to linger long after the cameras stopped, as though she could not fully separate herself from the emotions she portrayed. The line between character and self began to blur in ways she could not always control. She felt, perhaps unconsciously, the beginnings of strain, small fractures forming beneath the surface of her composure. These fractures were not yet visible to others, and perhaps not even fully visible to herself, but they were there, waiting. And through it all, whispers continued to follow her. Not yet the sharp, judgmental whispers of scandal, but quieter ones, curiosities, doubts, questions spoken behind closed doors. Some wondered whether she was too sensitive for Hollywood. Others believed she was too uncompromising to survive in an industry that demanded cooperation more than truth. One evening, after a long day of filming, she walked out of the studio into the cool night air. The lot was nearly empty, the lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. She paused, listening to the distant hum of a generator, the faint rustle of scripts left behind on a table inside. And in that moment, she felt the strangeness of her rising fame, a sense that she was ascending into a world that admired her talent but did not know her and perhaps did not want to. Behind her, somewhere inside the darkened building, newspapers rustled softly in a draft, their pages whispering of stories yet to be written, stories that would not always be kind. The soft rustling of those unseen newspapers lingers in the darkness, and from that faint, restless sound emerges the next movement in Frances Farmer's story, a movement shaped by the gradual tightening of the world around her, as though the machinery of Hollywood had begun to shift its gears in ways that would eventually grind against her spirit. As her reputation grew, so did the tension between her and the industry's unspoken demands, a tension that did not erupt suddenly, but accumulated like sediment, settling in layers too thin to notice at first, yet heavy enough over time to transform the landscape of her life. In those years, she stood at a crossroads, her talent undeniable, her presence sought after, yet her nature fundamentally at odds with the expectations placed upon her. It was as though she had stepped into an agreement she had not fully understood, one in which her individuality was both the reason for her ascent and the reason for the growing discomfort surrounding her. Studio executives admired her abilities but bristled at her independence. They needed her brilliance yet feared the unpredictability of her honesty. Hollywood of the 1930s and early 1940s required its stars to be more symbolic than human, predictable in their charm, agreeable in their public image, and willing to surrender personal boundaries in service to marketable dreams. But Frances did not surrender. She questioned scripts when the motivations felt false. She resisted studio-mandated interviews that attempted to flatten her identity into a pleasant but empty narrative. She pushed back against directors who expected obedience rather than collaboration. These actions were not dramatic rebellions. They were small, steady refusals to be reshaped. Yet in an industry built on control, such refusals took on a dangerous significance. During these years, her relationships with the studios began to fray. She worked on films that demanded emotional intensity, roles that drew from her a depth others could only imitate. But the very qualities that made her performances exceptional also made her difficult to categorize. She did not fit the mold of the cheerful ingenue, nor the glamorous vamp, nor the wholesome girl next door. She was all fire and introspection, a combination studios found both compelling and unsettling. They struggled to define her, to market her, to fold her into the familiar patterns that dictated success. And because she did not fit easily, they began to treat her as an anomaly. Valuable, yes, but increasingly inconvenient. Her personal life, too, became entwined with these pressures. Friends observed her growing restlessness, a sense of frustration that seemed to sharpen over time. She confided in a few that she felt confined, as though the industry had built invisible walls around her. The more she tried to express her truth, the more resistance she encountered. Her interviews became battlegrounds, moments when her candor clashed with reporters expecting rehearsed pleasantries. A single misinterpreted remark could spin into a rumor. A moment of visible irritation could evolve into a whispered assessment of instability. And since Frances had no interest in concealing her true thoughts, these misinterpretations multiplied. One of the turning points came when she openly criticized the superficiality she observed within the industry, offering reflections that were not hostile, but undeniably sharp. Though her critiques were grounded in sincerity, they were received as signs of ingratitude. It was not that she sought conflict, it was that she could not bear pretension. Yet Hollywood thrived on precisely the kind of pretense she rejected, and so friction deepened. What began as quiet tension became something more pointed. Small confrontations on set, moments when she pushed back against overbearing studio representatives, disagreements that she carried with calm conviction, but which others interpreted as defiance. Her mother's presence in her life also played a role in the slow unraveling. Their relationship, long marked by a tug-of-war between control and independence, became more strained as Frances grew more successful. Her mother wished to guide her, shape her, protect her from failure, but in doing so often pulled her back into a mold Frances had struggled to escape. Letters between them revealed a complicated web of affection, expectation, and disappointment. Frances longed for understanding, for emotional refuge, yet found herself repeatedly thrust into battles over autonomy. These conflicts, though private, fed quietly into the larger sense of pressure that defined her life in these years. As her internal tensions grew, the external pressures intensified. The studio system demanded complete control over its stars, where they went, how they dressed, what they said. Frances's resistance, once tolerated as part of her charm, was now seen as a liability. Executives whispered that she was too strong-willed, too emotional, too unwilling to play the game. Some directors hesitated to hire her, not because they doubted her talent, but because they feared the complications her independence might bring. The whispers expanded into judgments, judgments into narratives, and narratives into a reputation she could not escape. Her personal relationships fared no better. While she attracted admirers easily, she found few who truly understood her. She entered romances that flickered brightly at first, but dimmed under the weight of expectations. Some partners admired her intellect but recoiled from her intensity. Others enjoyed the thrill of her independence but lacked the depth to navigate her emotional complexity. Frances sought connection, but connection required vulnerability, and vulnerability required a space where she felt safe. Hollywood offered many things: fame, opportunity, visibility, but safety was rarely among them. There were moments when she must have felt herself slipping, though the world had not yet recognized the signs. She experienced periods of exhaustion, of frustration so palpable it left her quiet for days. At times she withdrew, not dramatically, but with a subtle heaviness that those close to her could sense. Her work, though still excellent, began to feel draining rather than fulfilling. She expressed dissatisfaction with projects that once excited her. She questioned whether the sacrifice of privacy and autonomy was worth the fleeting reward of acclaim. And then came the first public breakdown, an incident that would be exaggerated in the press, distorted through retellings, and ultimately used to frame a narrative of instability that overshadowed the truth. The details varied depending on who recounted them. Some said she lashed out in anger. Others claimed she collapsed in despair. The reality, likely more nuanced, disappeared beneath sensational headlines. The public, drawn to the spectacle of a star faltering, whispered eagerly. The studio, fearing damage to its image, responded with calculated distance. And Frances, caught between humiliation and confusion, faced the first true cracks in her public identity. The aftermath of this moment marked the beginning of her descent. Not a sudden plummet, but a steady erosion of the structures that had held her life together. Her disagreements with studios intensified. Roles grew fewer. Her reputation darkened. And all the while, she carried an expanding weight inside her, a mixture of anger, sorrow, and bewilderment at how quickly admiration could turn into judgment. One evening, after a particularly tense confrontation with studio representatives, she found herself alone in her dressing room. The mirror reflected an image she barely recognized: tired eyes, a strained expression, a posture that sagged under invisible burdens. The phone on the small table beside her began to ring, its sound sharp in the stillness. She stared at it, listening to its persistence, unable to decide whether to answer. The ringing echoed through the empty room, unanswered, unresolved, fading slowly into silence. The unanswered ringing drifts into stillness, settling like dust across the dim room, and from that quiet emerges the next chapter of Frances Farmer's life, where the slow erosion of her public image begins to harden into something heavier, more merciless, shaped by an industry and a nation eager for captivating stories, even at the cost of a human being's dignity. It was in this period that the newspapers, once merely curious about Frances's seriousness and independence, turned increasingly voracious. Hollywood gossip columns, hungry for scandals that stirred public fascination, began to seize upon every misstep, magnifying small incidents into grand narratives and casting Frances not as a gifted actress wrestling with internal conflict, but as a reckless, unstable figure spiraling into chaos. The truth, as it often is, lay in the quiet spaces between these extremes, but few had the patience to look there. Sensation drew more readers than nuance, and Frances, already vulnerable, became a convenient subject for stories that blurred fact and fiction. The trouble began with a series of arrests that were far less dramatic than the headlines suggested. A traffic violation, a heated argument, a moment of frustration turned into an exaggerated tale of violence. Policemen, studio agents, and reporters each added their own interpretations, shaping events into spectacles that fit the public's appetite for drama. Frances's own voice, measured, complex, and easily misunderstood, was drowned beneath layers of commentary. The first arrest was reported with sharp, judgmental tones, painting her as a woman losing control. When the second occurred, the public's imagination ignited, and columnists speculated openly about her mental state, her morality, her supposed self-destruction. The press rarely paused to ask what pressures she had faced, what exhaustion she carried, or what misunderstandings might have shaped the events. Instead, they framed her as a tragic figure, unraveling before the nation's eyes. Frances, bewildered by the intensity of the public reaction, found herself caught between frustration and shame. She tried to explain her side of the story, but explanations were rarely printed, and when they were, they came filtered through the dismissive tone of writers who had already chosen their narrative. Her candor, once admired, was now seen as proof of instability. Her refusal to perform the expected contrition was interpreted as arrogance, and because she had never mastered the art of hiding her emotions, her visible distress only fueled further speculation. It was as though each attempt to defend herself became another thread woven into the tapestry of scandal that now surrounded her. The arrests were not the only source of turmoil. The pressure from studios intensified, fueled by their fears that her growing reputation for volatility would reflect poorly on their brand. Meetings with executives became fraught with tension. She was reprimanded for behavior they deemed unprofessional, even when the supposed transgressions were minor or misunderstood. She was told to apologize publicly for incidents she believed had been misrepresented. She was urged to take a step back, to rest, to regain composure. But the rest they offered was not the kind that healed. It was the kind that controlled, that masked, that shaped public perception through carefully crafted statements rather than authentic recovery. Amid these pressures, Frances's personal relationships continued to fray. People who once admired her intensity now struggled to understand her pain. Some distanced themselves, uncomfortable with the growing cloud of scandal. Others attempted to help but found themselves overwhelmed by the complexity of her circumstances. She'd always been a woman of strong emotions, someone who felt deeply and thought intensely, and in this period, those qualities, once her strength, became entangled with her vulnerability. Her reactions at times grew sharper, her frustration more pronounced, her sorrow more visible, and Hollywood, ever intolerant of any deviation from its preferred narrative, quickly labeled these expressions as evidence of instability. In the midst of this turmoil, Frances found moments of clarity, moments when she sought to articulate her feelings with the same honesty that had always guided her. Yet these moments were rarely rewarded. Interviews that might have allowed her to express her truth were edited or framed to support the sensational narrative. Friends who might have offered solace were themselves overwhelmed by the intensity of the situation. Her mother, whose influence loomed large in her life, responded with a mixture of concern and control, pushing for decisions that Frances felt stripped her of autonomy. The tension between them grew sharper, and Frances often felt caught between the demands of her family and the demands of the industry, neither of which offered room for her to simply exist as herself. As the months progressed, the psychological strain became increasingly visible. She experienced bouts of anger, brief but striking, moments when the injustice of her treatment became unbearable. She grew weary of defending herself, weary of seeing her name distorted in print after print, weary of being cast as a spectacle rather than a person. And when exhaustion overtook her, it did so with a heaviness that frightened even those who knew her well. The studio system, with its unwavering emphasis on image and compliance, had no place for such vulnerability. Their response was not compassion but intervention. Intervention that would soon take a form far more drastic than Frances could have imagined. The culmination of this period arrived one night when an argument erupted into a headline, an incident that spiraled into myth before the details had even been verified. The newspapers seized upon it with ravenous energy, portraying Frances in terms that bordered on monstrous. They described her as violent, unhinged, dangerous, using words crafted to provoke fear and fascination. The truth, far more mundane, far more human, was lost beneath the sensationalism. And as her public image collapsed under the weight of these stories, the path toward her institutionalization began to take shape. Her mother, concerned for her daughter's well-being but influenced by the societal norms of the time, became a key figure in the decision to seek professional intervention. Whether she acted out of fear, confusion, or genuine belief that Frances needed help remains a subject of debate, overshadowed by the tragedy of what followed. For Frances, the sense of losing control over her own life became overwhelming. She felt betrayed by the press, misunderstood by the public, constrained by the studios, and now, in some sense, abandoned by those closest to her. When the authorities arrived to take her into custody after another publicized incident, an event later told in contradictory accounts, Frances experienced a rupture that marked the end of one life and the beginning of another. She was transported not as a celebrated actress, but as a troubled figure escorted under watch, a transformation that must have felt both surreal and devastating. Reporters clamored for photographs, capturing her distress in images that would be printed across the country as evidence of her supposed collapse. These images fixed her in the public imagination not as a gifted artist, but as a cautionary figure. A woman undone by her own temper, her own intensity, her own refusal to bend. And as the cameras flashed, freezing her anguished expression into a permanent artifact of scandal, the air around her seemed to grow colder, heavier, as though the world had begun to close in. Behind her, the click of a camera shutter echoed, sharp and final, capturing not just a moment, but the beginning of a long and painful descent into institutional control. The sharp click of the camera shutter fades slowly into the distance, like a door closing somewhere far behind her, and what follows is a stretch of her life, defined not by performance or ambition, but by confinement, confusion, and the overwhelming weight of being seen only through the distorted lens of scandal. Frances Farmer entered her years of institutionalization not as a willing patient seeking healing, but as a woman swept into a system that believed discipline and restraint were the primary treatments for emotional suffering. The moment she crossed the threshold of that first institution, something in her must have felt the heavy truth of losing control over her own story. The world she had known, bright sets, bustling streets, the rhythm of rehearsals, fell away, replaced by sterile hallways, locked doors, and the constant hum of surveillance. Here, the fragility that had lain quietly beneath her defiance was met not with compassion, but with procedures designed to contain, to correct, to subdue. Her early days inside such institutions were muddled with fear and disbelief. The routines imposed upon her were rigid, each day structured around meals, assessments, and enforced stillness. For a woman whose life had been marked by expressive intensity, such stillness must have felt suffocating. She encountered staff who viewed her not as a complex individual, but as a problem to be managed, a patient whose emotions were symptoms, whose frustrations were evidence of disorder, whose independence was a threat to the structure they maintained. She was assessed by doctors who operated within the limited psychiatric understanding of their time, men who believed strongly in their methods but lacked the language or perspective to see her as whole. They viewed her through diagnosis rather than humanity, measuring her responses against a narrow standard they deemed normal. And yet, amid this clinical detachment, Frances tried at first to reason with them, to explain her fear, her confusion, her sense of injustice. But explanations were often interpreted not as clarity, but as resistance. It is difficult to imagine the extent of her isolation during this period. Removed from the world she had known, stripped of autonomy, she entered a realm where the perceptions of others carried more authority than her own truth. Reports from caregivers varied. Some spoke of her cooperativeness in moments of calm, others described agitation, defiance, or despair. These conflicting accounts later fed into the swirling myths that surrounded her life, making it nearly impossible to distinguish her authentic emotional state from the interpretations of those who observed her. What is clear, however, is that she was a woman in distress, navigating an environment designed not to understand her, but to contain her. The more she expressed her frustration, the more firmly the system responded with interventions meant to pacify. The more desperately she sought control, the more rigorously it was taken from her. As weeks turned to months and months into years, the walls of institutional life pressed inward. There were days when she fell into quiet compliance, exhausted by the constant tension between her inner truth and her external restrictions. These were moments of surrender, not acceptance. Moments when she allowed the routines to carry her because fighting them drained what little strength she had left. Then there were days when her defiance flared again, driven by the fierce will that had always shaped her, a defiance that resulted in harsher responses from staff who misunderstood her resistance as aggression. These cycles created a pattern that the institution interpreted as instability, yet within the context of her suffering, they appear as the natural expressions of a spirit struggling to endure the weight placed upon it. The treatments she endured, some documented, others obscured by time and rumor, reflected an era of psychiatric practice that often blurred the boundaries between healing and discipline. Certain interventions were intended to calm, others to correct behavior, and still others to break resistance altogether. The truth of what occurred behind those locked doors remained largely hidden from the public eye, giving rise to stories both factual and exaggerated. Some former employees later recounted harsh methods, describing an environment lacking empathy. Others insisted the staff did what they believed best under the circumstances, constrained by the norms of the time. And Frances herself, once free, spoke of these experiences with a mixture of restraint and sorrow, offering glimpses but rarely full revelations. It is in this silence, in these half-formed recollections, that the real tragedy lies, not only in the suffering she endured, but in the way the world allowed her story to be shaped by speculation rather than truth. Throughout these years, her sense of self seemed to waver between clarity and fragmentation. There were moments when she remembered who she had been, the intellectual young woman from Seattle, the fearless performer on stage, the outspoken actress who rejected Hollywood's demands. At other times, the relentless sameness of institutional life made those memories feel distant, almost unreal. She wrote letters when permitted, some filled with longing for freedom, others expressing a numb resignation. Friends who attempted to visit her described her as changed, though the change varied depending on the observer. Some saw a woman defeated, others saw flashes of the old fire. But even those who recognized her strength could not undo the system's hold on her. And yet, amid this bleakness, small pockets of humanity persisted. a nurse who spoke gently to her, recognizing the person beneath the diagnosis, a fellow patient who shared stories of their own lost life, creating a bond of shared suffering. A rare day when the sunlight filtered through the barred window just so, offering a fleeting reminder of a world beyond confinement. These moments did not heal her, but they kept her connected, however faintly, to the remnants of hope that had not yet been extinguished. When she was transferred between institutions, the transitions were disorienting, each new place carrying its own set of routines, its own interpretations of her behavior. At times, she must have wondered if she would ever reclaim her freedom, or whether she was destined to remain in such places indefinitely. Her mother, deeply involved in decisions concerning her care, believed she was acting in Frances's best interest, yet her actions became another force controlling her daughter's fate. The tension between them persisted even at a distance, shaped by love, fear, and misunderstanding. Frances longed to be seen as capable, as someone who simply needed to breathe again outside the suffocating structures that defined her treatment. But the world around her, family, institutions, industry, saw her through lenses clouded by fear and expectation. As the years passed, her identity became increasingly shaped by the narratives imposed upon her. The public, reading sensationalized accounts of her behavior, viewed her as a tragic figure beyond redemption. Hollywood, having once courted her talent, now regarded her as a liability. And Frances herself, navigating the corridors of confinement, must have felt the weight of these perceptions even in moments of solitude. It is in this period that her spirit, once fierce and unwavering, began to show signs of fracture, not broken, but strained under pressures no person could bear alone. One night, after a day of harsh treatment and emotional turmoil, she found herself alone in a quiet corridor. The faint hum of fluorescent lights echoed overhead. The walls felt both impossibly close and endlessly far. And somewhere down the hallway, a door closed with a soft, final click, leaving her suspended in that narrow space between despair and the faintest glimmer of endurance. It was a moment suspended in time, unresolved, like a breath held too long. The soft, final click of that distant door lingers in the corridor air, a quiet punctuation that does not offer closure, but rather deepens the uncertainty of all that Frances endured behind those walls. Out of that faint vibration rises the next stretch of her story, a place where truth and myth intertwine so tightly that even the passing decades have struggled to separate them. For it is within the shadowed rooms of the institutions that the most controversial claims of her life took root, not merely in what happened to her, but in the stories others would later tell, reshaping her suffering into narratives that served their own purposes. These were the years when the world outside increasingly lost sight of the real woman, replacing her instead with an icon of tragedy, a symbol distorted by the lenses of fear, fascination, and misunderstanding. The nature of Frances's institutionalization became fertile ground for speculation almost immediately. Reporters, denied access to the facilities but hungry for material, relied on whispers from unnamed sources, embellishing each rumor until it resembled something far more dramatic than reality. They spoke of rebellious outbursts, of violent episodes, of treatments invoked more as punishment than cure. Their words painted her as a figure spiraling into darkness, a once bright star consumed by madness. And because the public had already been primed by earlier scandals, they were ready to believe the worst. Yet what remains most striking about this period is how little certainty survives. For every documented fact, there exists a conflicting account. For every claim of cruelty, a testimony of compassion. For every harsh description of her behavior, a recollection of calm and coherence. It is within this ambiguity that the most enduring myths were born. Some former employees later shared stories of practices that today would be unthinkable. Treatments imposed without consent, restraints used more readily than conversation. Others denied such accounts, insisting that Frances was treated according to the standards of the time and that the stories of brutality were exaggerated or fabricated. Even Frances herself, in her later years, spoke with a complicated restraint. At times, she seemed determined to leave the past sealed. At others, she hinted at experiences that haunted her, but that she could not or would not fully articulate. This silence, intentional or otherwise, created a vacuum that others filled with speculation. Authors, filmmakers, and advocates shaped her story into symbols of broader struggles, sometimes with empathy, sometimes with opportunism. One of the most controversial claims involved the suggestion that Frances was subjected to extreme forms of treatment, stories that spread widely through memoirs, films, and retellings long after the events occurred. These accounts, though gripping, were often based on secondhand anecdotes, recollections clouded by time, or narratives shaped to provoke emotion rather than convey truth. Some insisted that she endured harsh corrections meant to break the will of non-compliant patients. Others argued that such claims were sensational fabrications, created to cast institutions of that era in the harshest possible light. The reality likely exists somewhere between these poles, a mixture of genuine suffering and exaggerated legend, a story in which neither complete denial nor complete acceptance of the darkest accounts feels entirely truthful. Yet beyond the disputed details lies a deeper truth. Frances lived through years in which her autonomy, her dignity, and her identity were repeatedly challenged. Regardless of the specifics of her treatment, the experience itself, being confined, being misunderstood, being spoken for rather than listened to, left marks that no subsequent denial or justification can erase. The emotional weight of these years, the psychological strain of being seen only as a patient rather than a person, shaped her in ways that reverberated long after she left those institutions behind. And while myths may distort the details, they arise from a core reality. Frances suffered, not because she was monstrous or unmanageable, but because she lived in a time when emotional distress was often met with force rather than compassion. Outside the institution walls, her story took on a life of its own. Authors who never met her crafted sensational biographies. Films portrayed her as a tragic heroine shattered by a cruel system. Activists invoked her name as evidence of psychiatric injustice. Each version, though perhaps born from good intentions or genuine belief, added another layer between her true self and the person the world imagined. The real Frances, brilliant, sensitive, complicated, imperfect, became increasingly obscured by these layers. And the weight of these distorted images followed her long after she stepped back into the outside world, shaping public perception in ways she could not control. During this time, Frances's family dynamics grew even more fraught. Her mother, who had played a central role in committing her, became a figure of deep controversy in the story of her life. Some painted her as controlling, a woman whose fear and judgment pushed her daughter into institutions unnecessarily. Others saw her as someone overwhelmed by circumstances she did not understand, acting within the limited knowledge and resources available to her. The truth, as with much of Frances's story, likely lies in a painful tension between love and fear, misunderstanding and intention. Whatever her motivations, Frances's sense of betrayal was real, and it added a piercing emotional thread to the already tangled fabric of her suffering. In the quieter moments of her institutional life, Frances encountered people who saw glimmers of her true self. Nurses who noticed her intelligence, doctors who recognized her coherence, fellow patients who shared their struggles with her in hushed tones. These connections, though fleeting, reminded her that she was not entirely lost, that fragments of her identity persisted beneath the layers of misrepresentation and control. She had days when she felt almost like herself again, moments when conversation and reflection brought clarity. But these moments were fragile, easily overshadowed by the routines and restrictions of her environment. As the years passed, something within her began to shift. Whether through exhaustion, resilience, or quiet adaptation, she developed a way of navigating her confinement that allowed her to endure. She complied more readily with certain routines, spoke less about her frustrations, revealed less of her inner turmoil. This outward calm was sometimes interpreted as recovery, sometimes as resignation. It is impossible to know which interpretation holds more truth. Perhaps she carried both within her, an internal balancing act between survival and self-preservation, between endurance and retreat. Outside, the world continued to tell her story without her. Newspapers printed exaggerated updates, magazine columns speculated about her future, and Hollywood, having washed its hands of her, moved on to new faces, new stars, new narratives. Frances, once a rising talent, now existed largely as a symbol of caution, a name invoked more for gossip than for artistry. Her film slipped from public consciousness, overshadowed by the legend of her downfall. Yet even amid this erasure, the real Frances did not fully disappear. There were whispers from former colleagues who remembered her brilliance, letters from acquaintances who hoped she might someday return. And in rare interviews years later, a few reporters described speaking with her and being struck by her intelligence, her dry wit, her clarity of thought, qualities that contradicted the myths that had grown in her absence. These glimpses serve as reminders that the woman behind the legend was never as simple or as broken as the stories suggested. Still, within the institution walls, she must have felt the full weight of being misremembered by a world she could not reach. Nights stretched long, days blurred, and somewhere in that quiet isolation, she sensed that even if she were released, she would return to a life shaped by misconceptions she could never undo. One evening, after another day of structured silence, she stood near a barred window, looking out at the faint outline of a tree bending in the wind. The branches shifted gently, almost imperceptibly, as though carrying a message she could not decipher. She watched until the light faded, leaving only the silhouette of the branches against the darkening sky, suspended in stillness, unresolved. The silhouette of those branches against the darkening sky lingers in her memory like an unanswered question, and from that dim outline arises the next quiet turning in Frances Farmer's life, a period when stories about her, true, false, and imagined, grew into a labyrinth of whispers that no longer needed her presence to thrive. As she drifted through the final stages of institutional life, the world outside was already reshaping her into a figure more myth than human, a symbol more than a woman, a cautionary tale more than an artist. The truth of her suffering slipped into the background, replaced by the powerful allure of narrative, stories that the public consumed eagerly, despite knowing so little of the reality hidden behind locked doors. These myths, born of fragments and shadows, would cling to her long after her release, altering not only how others saw her, but how she herself began to imagine her own past. Whispers of shocking events circulated in magazines and memoirs, retold with unnerving confidence by people who had never met her. They described treatments of unspeakable cruelty, invented dramatic outbursts, exaggerated moments of despair. Some accounts insisted she had been broken beyond repair. Others suggested she had fought with a ferocity that defied comprehension. The truth, veiled by time and inconsistency, was far more complicated, but complexity rarely captivates the public imagination. Simplicity does. Extremes do. And so, the woman who had once been celebrated for her intelligence and emotional depth was now reduced to a storyline that prioritized drama over understanding. Farmer's institutional records, sparse and clinical, offered none of the sensational details that later storytellers claimed. Yet the absence of clarity allowed the myths to take root more deeply. People filled the gaps with speculation, weaving narratives that suited their own agendas. Some used her story to condemn the psychiatric systems of the past. Others used it to craft melodramatic depictions of Hollywood tragedy. Still others sensationalized her suffering to sell books or reinforce their own theories about the dangers of nonconformity. Frances herself was nearly voiceless in this process, her silence becoming a canvas onto which others projected their imaginations. One of the most persistent myths, one retold in books, dramatizations, and whispered recollections, claimed that she had undergone brutal procedures intended to subdue her spirit entirely. Some versions insisted these treatments were routine. Others implied they were inflicted as punishment for her defiance. Supporters of such tales spoke with conviction, citing unnamed witnesses or unverifiable memories. Skeptics dismissed these accounts as fabrications. Historians remain divided, unsure whether the truth lies in harsh reality, exaggerated rumor, or a blend of both. What is often overlooked is that Frances herself never publicly confirmed the darkest of these stories, nor did she fully deny them. Her silence was not indifference, it was the silence of someone who had endured more than words could express, more than a simplified narrative could hold. Her family's role in these years also became a subject of speculation. Her mother, long a figure of complex influence, was portrayed alternately as a villainous force who sought control and as a desperate parent overwhelmed by circumstances too large for her to manage. Those who despised her mother pointed to Frances's confinement as evidence of coercion. Those who sympathized with her believed she acted within the limited understanding of her time. Yet neither interpretation seemed to capture the full truth of a relationship rooted in love, fear, misunderstanding, and impossible choices. Frances, caught between public judgment and private emotion, held her own counsel, rarely speaking of her mother with bitterness, but not offering absolution either. Outside the institution, Hollywood executives watched her from a distance, their earlier interest in her talent replaced by discomfort, guilt, or indifference. Some had quietly regretted how the industry had failed her. Others dismissed her situation as an unfortunate consequence of her own temperament, but few spoke openly on her behalf, for speaking up meant acknowledging that the system they upheld might have played a part in her downfall. Silence protected them, even as it further complicated Frances's story. When news occasionally surfaced about her condition, usually through vague, contradictory reports, it was presented as if she were a character rather than a real woman. Articles questioned whether she would ever return to the screen, whether her brilliance had been permanently extinguished, whether her spirit had been shattered beyond recognition. They rarely asked what she might need, what she might feel, or how she wished her life to unfold. Her humanity disappeared beneath speculation, the way a person's face fades beneath repeated tracings until the original expression is unrecognizable. Yet even as these narratives spread, fragments of the real Frances persisted, glimpses offered by staff members who recalled her articulate conversations, by visiting acquaintances who noticed her flashes of lucidity, by doctors who described her as reflective and intelligent despite her suffering. These small details reveal a woman who was never the caricature the world imagined, a woman who endured confusion and pain with a resilience that went largely unnoticed. And though the myths overshadowed these quieter truths, they could not erase them entirely. As time passed, the outside world began to shift. Public attitudes toward mental health evolved slowly. Investigations into psychiatric institutions exposed systemic problems. Memoirs by former patients brought hidden realities into the open. In this changing landscape, Frances's story was repeatedly lifted as an example, sometimes fairly, sometimes unfairly, of the harm inflicted on vulnerable individuals. She became a symbol for many, whether or not she wished to be one. Her name appeared in debates, books, and documentaries, often invoked with more certainty than accuracy. And in this strange process, the myths that once distorted her life were sometimes used not to harm her reputation, but to argue for reform, leaving her both exploited and championed at once. These competing narratives created a strange, unsettled legacy that followed her far beyond her years of institutionalization. When she was eventually released, stepping back into a world that had long speculated about her fate, she found herself overshadowed by stories she had not written and could not control. People who met her in those later years described her as composed, thoughtful, even humorous in ways that contradicted the dramatic image of brokenness perpetuated by the press. Yet she carried a quiet heaviness, an inwardness shaped not only by what she had endured, but by the knowledge that her identity had been rewritten in ways she could never fully reclaim. It is tempting to ask whether Frances ever tried to correct the myths, but perhaps she understood better than anyone that stories, once loosed into the world, develop lives of their own. The effort to silence them would have required reliving pain she preferred to leave behind, and so she moved forward, carrying both the truth and the distortions like twin shadows cast by the same light. One late afternoon, as she walked away from the institution where she had spent so many difficult years, she paused near the gates, looking toward the road that led back into her life. The air was quiet, the light soft, and in the distance the branches of a tree swayed slightly with the wind. For a moment she stood there, suspended between the weight of the stories others had told and the fragile possibility of writing her own again, if the world would allow it. The faint swaying of those branches at the gate follows her like a soft echo as she steps into the long, uncertain stretch of the years that came after, years quieter than the turmoil that preceded them, yet marked by a different kind of struggle, one that unfolded not in the glare of public scandal, but in the fragile, unsteady attempt to rebuild a life after so much had been taken. Frances Farmer's return to the world was not met with fanfare, nor with warmth, nor with the triumphant arc one might imagine in a story seeking reassurance. Instead, she re-entered life like someone emerging from a long, disorienting dream, trying to reacquaint herself with a world that had moved on in her absence. The newspapers that once tracked her every misstep now devoted their attention to fresher faces, newer scandal, brighter tragedies. And Hollywood, which had watched her unravel from afar, greeted her return with a silence that spoke far more loudly than condemnation ever had. Yet, in this quiet, Frances found both difficulty and possibility. She was no longer the rising star with untempered fire in her voice, nor the troubled figure portrayed in headlines. She was something in between, a woman in transition, carrying invisible wounds and unspoken memories, trying to regain her footing on ground that no longer felt familiar. The years in institutions had reshaped her relationship with the world. They had carved out spaces of resignation and resilience within her, leaving behind a woman who still possessed intelligence and depth, but who now measured her steps with a different kind of caution. It was not fear that guided her, nor defeat, but a quiet awareness of how easily one could be misunderstood, misjudged, unmade. In her attempt to rebuild herself, Frances gravitated toward work not defined by ambition, but by necessity. She accepted jobs that offered stability rather than stardom. Clerical work, hotel positions, small administrative roles that allowed her to move anonymously through her days. These tasks did not call upon her artistry or her intellectual fire, but they offered something she had long been denied, a semblance of control. For the first time in years, she could choose when to speak and when to stay silent, when to remain unseen and when to step forward. And though the work was modest, it gave her a sense of grounding that had eluded her during the tumult of Hollywood and the confinement of institutional life. Still, the transition was not simple. There were days when the past rose sharply, like an unexpected gust of cold wind catching her breath. Days when a familiar song, a passing comment, or a stray memory would pull her back into the corridors she wished to forget. But there were also days when she discovered small joys in ordinary routines, conversations with coworkers who knew nothing of her fame, walks through quiet neighborhoods where no one recognized her, evenings when she read books without thinking about how her opinions would be interpreted. These moments, though gentle and unremarkable to others, carried immense meaning for her. They represented a life lived on her own terms, however limited those terms might be. Her relationship with her family, particularly with her mother, remained complicated. They shared a history too heavy to simply dissolve, yet too intertwined to sever cleanly. Frances visited her mother on occasion, their conversations marked by polite restraint rather than open affection. They spoke of practical matters, avoided probing into past decisions, and maintained a delicate balance that kept old wounds from reopening. Whether forgiveness existed between them is difficult to know. Perhaps they both reached a quiet understanding that some relationships can only survive in fragments, held together not by resolution, but by mutual acceptance of what cannot be undone. Despite her effort to live quietly, the shadows of her former fame did not vanish entirely. Every so often, someone recognized her. An older filmgoer who remembered her intense gaze on the screen, a journalist curious about her disappearance, a former colleague surprised to find her behind a desk rather than on a stage. These encounters were infused with a strange mixture of nostalgia and awkwardness. Those who approached her often expected to find the passionate young actress frozen in time, unchanged by the years or the suffering she had endured. Instead, they met a woman who had weathered storms they could not imagine, a woman who no longer needed to explain herself or perform for others. Some left disappointed, others quietly moved. But Frances, having lived through the distortion of her public image, no longer felt compelled to match anyone's expectations. It was during this period of quiet living that she began, subtly and cautiously, to reconnect with parts of herself she thought she had lost. She involved herself in small local theater productions, not as a star returning triumphantly to the stage, but as a participant rediscovering a familiar language. Her performances were gentle, introspective, devoid of the urgency that once defined her acting. Those who saw her noted the quiet maturity she brought to her roles, a softness that had not existed in her earlier work. Acting no longer served as a battleground for truth or expression. It became a space of calm, a way to speak when words alone felt insufficient. In those limited performances, she reclaimed something the world had tried to take from her. Not fame, but voice. Yet the possibility of a full return to Hollywood was never real, at least not in the way the public sometimes fantasized. The industry that had once celebrated her brilliance now saw her as a liability, a reminder of the uncomfortable truth that its demands could crush those who resisted. Younger actresses had taken her place, eager to mold themselves into the shapes the studios required, and Hollywood, in its relentless forward motion, had little space for a woman who had not only stepped outside the system, but had been publicly broken by it. Frances understood this, and perhaps she no longer desired that world anyway. The cost she had paid was too high to willingly re-enter the arena where her selfhood had been so deeply threatened. Even so, she remained aware of the distorted versions of herself circulating in the world. Stories continued to surface, retold by writers and dramatized in ways that prioritized shock over nuance. Some portrayed her as irredeemably shattered, others as a heroic survivor of unimaginable cruelty. Rarely did anyone seek the quiet middle ground where the real Frances resided, a woman shaped by suffering but not defined by it, a woman whose strength lay not in dramatic triumph, but in the patient endurance of ordinary life. It must have been strange, perhaps even painful, to know that the world held such distorted images of her, yet feel too weary or too wise to attempt correction. In the last stretch of this period, Frances found herself settling into a rhythm that was neither grand nor tragic. Her life became a series of days marked by simple tasks, brief conversations, and moments of introspection. There were evenings when she sat alone at her kitchen table, the quiet hum of a refrigerator replacing the buzz of studio lights, her thoughts drifting through the landscape of her past. Memories not of fame or scandal, but of small human moments that had once mattered. A kind remark from a stagehand, a gentle touch from a fellow patient, a letter received at just the right moment. These memories anchored her, reminding her that even amid great turmoil, there had been threads of connection that kept her from fading completely. One such evening, she began to write a letter she never finished. The paper lay before her with only a few lines, hesitating between apology and reflection, between confession and silence. Her pen paused mid-sentence, as though she had reached a place where words could go no further. She left the letter on the table when she rose to make tea, and there it remained, a quiet fragment of thought, unfinished, unresolved. The unfinished letter on the kitchen table rests in the quiet of her home like a breath held too long, and as the night settles around it, that gesture of pause becomes the doorway into the tangled realm of Frances Farmer's personal relationships, those fragile, flickering connections that shaped her inner world as much as any public triumph or tragedy. For though her institutionalization and the pressures of fame left visible marks, it was in her relationships with family, lovers, and fleeting companions that some of the deepest wounds formed and reopened, over and over, like an echo that would not fade. These ties, marked by affection, misunderstanding, and loss, created a tapestry of human presence that both sustained her and strained her spirit. In her early years, long before Hollywood or headlines, Frances's relationships were shaped by the complexities of her family home. Her mother, Lillian, remains one of the most controversial figures in her story, a woman whose determination, unwavering certainty, and fierce protectiveness often collided with Frances's longing for independence. Their bond was not the simple narrative of oppressive parent and rebellious child that later observers imagined. It was far more intricate, woven with genuine love, yet shadowed by a deep incompatibility. Frances, with her restless mind and emotive intensity, needed space to explore her own identity. Her mother, guided by fear of failure and the social mores of her time, believed discipline and structure were the keys to success. These differences, subtle at first, intensified as Frances aged, creating a rift that would later widen into something nearly impossible to bridge. Their arguments, though rarely explosive, carried a strange heaviness. Lillian's attempts to shape her daughter's life, her education, her career, even her emotional decisions, were rooted in a desire to protect her from hardship. Yet Frances experienced those efforts as confinement. Each directive, each criticism, each plan laid out for her future felt like a tightening noose, restricting her ability to breathe freely. As Frances pursued acting and later rose in Hollywood, Lillian's involvement shifted from supportive curiosity to anxious control, and the more Frances resisted, the more tightly her mother grasped. These tensions did not erupt into dramatic confrontations, but simmered quietly, creating an emotional fog that neither woman could entirely dispel. When Frances's life began to unravel under public scrutiny, her mother's fears intensified, culminating in decisions that would define Frances's life for years to come. The institutionalization that followed, a choice her mother believed necessary, sharpened the fracture between them into something more profound. Frances felt betrayed, stripped of agency by someone who claimed to love her. Lillian felt overwhelmed, convinced she had acted out of desperation rather than cruelty. In the years that followed, their interactions grew cautious and fragmented, maintaining a veneer of civility that thinly concealed the ache beneath. Yet the mother-daughter bond, fragile as it was, endured in quiet gestures. A letter sent in careful handwriting, a holiday visit marked by restrained conversation, a simple meal shared without revisiting old wounds. They never fully reconciled, but neither did they sever the connection completely. It remained suspended, unresolved, much like the letter Frances left on her table, an expression of emotion without conclusion. Beyond her family, Frances's romantic relationships were equally complex, shaped by the intensity of her personality and the unpredictability of her circumstances. She attracted admirers easily. Her beauty, intelligence, and independence created a magnetic draw. But sustaining connection proved more difficult. Those drawn to her brilliance often underestimated the emotional depth that came with it. They expected charm, mystery, perhaps even volatility in small, manageable doses. But when confronted with the full landscape of her inner life, many retreated. She sought partners who could understand her, not merely admire her. She wanted conversation, shared curiosity, a meeting of minds. Yet Hollywood in her era offered few such opportunities. Men in the industry were often captivated by her, but intimidated by her intellect, uncertain how to navigate a woman who refused to be softened into an accessory for their own narratives. Some romantic partners attempted to tame her fiery independence, mistaking their control for care. Others claimed to appreciate her strength, yet recoiled when it clashed with their expectations. A few tried sincerely to support her, but were overwhelmed by the weight of her struggles, the intensity of her emotions, and the eventual shadow of her public decline. The relationships that followed her public collapse were even more fragile. Some people who once professed affection distanced themselves to avoid association with her scandal. Others expressed support, but did little to ease her isolation. She experienced connections that burned brightly but briefly, extinguished by misunderstandings or fear. Each broken tie left behind a quiet ache, adding to the tapestry of loneliness that increasingly defined her life. And yet, within this loneliness, she developed an acute awareness of the fragility of human attachment, understanding in ways few do how deeply people fear what they cannot control or fully comprehend. Friendships, too, were fraught with complexity. In her early Hollywood years, she formed bonds with fellow actors who admired her intensity, finding in her a presence unlike anyone else. But many of these friendships were built on the unstable ground of the studio system, which fostered camaraderie while simultaneously breeding competition and insecurity. When her reputation darkened, most of these so-called friends disappeared into silence or polite distance. Only a handful remained, offering occasional letters or visits that reminded her she was not entirely forgotten. These gestures may have seemed small to outsiders, but to Frances, they likely carried profound significance, moments of humanity that pierced the isolation imposed upon her. There were also those relationships formed during her institutional years, connections with fellow patients whose shared suffering created a bond that transcended words. These were friendships forged not through delight or leisure, but through mutual endurance. They whispered to one another in the quiet hours, shared fragmented memories of lives left behind, and offered small comforts, a stolen moment of humor, a reassured glance that made the unbearable slightly more bearable. These friendships, though often short-lived, softened the edges of her confinement and taught her a quiet truth, that even in the depths of despair, human beings reach for one another, seeking connection like a flame sheltered in cupped hands. After her release, Frances formed acquaintances within her workplaces, co-workers who knew nothing of her cinematic past and treated her simply as a colleague. Some grew fond of her reserved humor. Others admired her diligence. These relationships were not intimate, but they were steady, grounded in mutual respect rather than fascination or pity. Such steady connections may have offered her a kind of peace she had rarely known. To be seen not as a fallen star, not as a patient, not as an enigma, but simply as a person going about her daily life. This was a form of healing that eluded more dramatic gestures of recovery. Yet despite these moments of connection, Frances could never entirely escape the shadows of her past. In quiet evenings, when she sat alone in her living space, with only the soft hum of a radio or the ticking of a clock for company, she felt the presence of those who had come and gone. The mother she could not fully forgive, the lovers she could not fully keep, the friends she could not fully trust. These presences lingered like distant footsteps in a hallway, faint yet persistent, shaping the contours of her solitude without ever fully stepping into view. One night, as she lay awake listening to the wind brushing softly against the window, she imagined those footsteps again, soft, cautious, perhaps belonging to someone who had once cared for her but had retreated long ago. She turned slightly as though expecting to see a figure in the doorway, but there was only the quiet of the room, the pale glow of moonlight stretching across the floor, and the faint echo of footsteps that were not there. The faint echo of those imagined footsteps dissolves into the quiet of the room, and as the moonlight shifts slowly across the floorboards, the next chapter of Frances Farmer's wandering life takes shape, a chapter marked not by fame or scandal, but by a long, searching journey toward meaning outside the boundaries that once confined her. These were years in which she drifted not with the aimless desperation some imagined, but with a cautious, deliberate slowness, as though testing each new direction before allowing her weight to rest upon it. She had returned to a world that had changed in her absence, and though she carried the imprint of her past with her, she no longer sought to reclaim the life she had once known. Instead, she looked quietly for something simpler, something truer, something that might allow her to exist without the constant burden of expectation. Her first steps into this new life were tentative, marked by the kind of uncertainty that only someone profoundly altered can feel. In the years following her release, Frances explored various forms of work and community, not from a place of ambition, but from a desire to feel rooted again. She found herself drawn to modest routines, tasks that asked little of her public persona and much of her capacity for patience. There were jobs in small offices, where she managed paperwork with quiet competence. There were shifts in modest hotels where she greeted passing travelers with polite reserve. There were moments when she considered returning to writing, recalling the intellectual fire that had burned so brightly in her youth. But the effort felt heavy, as though that flame flickered now behind a veil of long shadows. Acting, once the central pillar of her identity, re-entered her life in muted ways. Invitations arrived from regional theaters, smaller venues far removed from the bright glare of Hollywood. She accepted some of these invitations, stepping back onto the stage with a calmness that surprised even her. Gone was the fierce defiance of her early performances, the urgent need to express truths that others wished to ignore. In its place grew a softer, more contemplative presence, an acting style shaped by the depth of her experiences, yet free from the desperation that once fueled her intensity. Audiences in these small theaters recognized something remarkable in her, not brilliance blazing outward, but a quieter radiance that hovered at the edges of every gesture, every pause, every line spoken as though drawn from a deep well of memory. But even these performances were not attempts to reignite her career. They were, instead, brief returns to a language her spirit still remembered. Acting had once been an act of struggle, a way to force the world to acknowledge her inner life. Now it became a kind of meditation, a temporary home she could step into without the weight of expectation. Each role allowed her to inhabit a world not her own, to wander through emotional landscapes without fearing judgment, to reflect gently on the remnants of her former self. And when the curtain fell each night, she walked away without longing for applause or acclaim. She simply returned to the quiet rhythm of her days. Yet beneath these outward motions, an inner search continued. Frances seemed to move through life with the awareness that she was neither fully healed nor fully broken, suspended between the past and the present, like someone balancing on an invisible line. She read often: philosophy, literature, essays that probed the nature of suffering and identity. In these readings, she found fragments of language that resonated with her own experiences, words that gave shape to the moments she could not articulate. She kept notebooks filled with reflections, though she never intended to publish them. They were private attempts to understand herself, to reconcile the disparate pieces of her life without altering them into a neat narrative. At times, she sought meaning through small spiritual or philosophical explorations. She attended gatherings led by thinkers, artists, and local intellectuals who discussed topics ranging from existentialism to the nature of consciousness. She listened more than she spoke, absorbing ideas that allowed her to frame her suffering in broader terms, not as punishment or failure, but as a complex thread woven into the deeper fabric of human experience. Those who encountered her in these settings often remarked on the quiet wisdom she carried, a wisdom that did not present itself as authority, but as lived understanding. She did not preach, she did not lament, she simply observed, offering insights only when asked, and even then with humility. There were days, however, when the search felt futile, when memories of confinement or public judgment rose sharply, reminding her of all she had lost. On such days, she withdrew into solitude, taking long walks through quiet neighborhoods or sitting by the window with a cup of coffee, watching the passage of strangers as though trying to understand the distance between their lives and hers. She sometimes wondered whether she could ever fully belong anywhere again, whether the fragments of her past, scattered across so many landscapes, could ever be shaped into something whole. Yet even in these moments of sorrow, she carried a quiet resilience. She had endured too much to be undone by reflection alone. As she continued to drift through these in-between years, Frances also encountered kind souls who, without knowing her full story, offered gestures of compassion that brought unexpected comfort. A co-worker who shared lunch with her in silence, a neighbor who brought flowers to her doorstep during the spring thaw, a stranger who recognized her not from fame, but from a small theater performance and thanked her for a moving portrayal. These interactions were brief, but they rooted her in the present moment, reminding her that connection did not need to be dramatic to be meaningful. They served as reminders that humanity, even when quiet, can be profoundly gentle. With time, Frances grew more at ease with the ordinary. She allowed herself to enjoy small pleasures, a warm loaf of bread from a local bakery, the sound of rain against her window on a Sunday morning, the way sunlight filtered through curtains during the early hours of the day. These moments, seemingly trivial to others, represented a profound shift in her understanding of happiness. For someone who had lived through the extremes of fame and confinement, ordinary life was not dull. It was a refuge. Yet the question of meaning remained. What, after everything, was she meant to take from her journey? Was her suffering a cautionary lesson, a tragedy, or simply one life among many, shaped by forces both external and internal, neither wholly understood nor fully definable? Frances did not seek answers with urgency. She understood, perhaps more deeply than most, that meaning is not always something found. Sometimes it is something lived, quietly, moment by moment in the spaces where no one is watching. Late one evening, after returning from a small theater rehearsal, she entered her dimly lit home and set her keys on the table. The unfinished letter still rested there, its edges slightly curled, its ink faded. She looked at it for a long moment, not with the intention of finishing it, but with a kind of acceptance. Perhaps some things are meant to remain incomplete: letters, relationships, explanations, lives. As she turned away, the lone backstage light from her memory glowed faintly in her mind, a reminder of all the roles she had played, both willingly and unwillingly, and the quiet resilience that guided her forward. Behind her, in that memory, the solitary bulb above the backstage mirror flickered softly, casting a thin halo of light over an empty chair, as though waiting for someone who might or might not return. The soft flicker of that lone backstage bulb lingers in the mind, suspended in the dim air of an empty theater, and as its glow fades, the next quiet chapter of Frances Farmer's life unfolds. Those long, muted middle years in which she lived not as a star, not as a scandal, but as a woman who had stepped outside the shimmer of public life and into the quiet margins. These were years rarely spoken of in biographies or documentaries, years neither dramatic enough for public fascination nor triumphant enough for redemption. Narratives, but they were, in their own quiet way, the years that revealed the deepest truths about who Frances had become and how she sought to navigate a world that had once consumed her so completely. In these middle years, Frances settled into a rhythm that many would call ordinary, but that, for her, was nothing short of profound. After the turbulence that had defined her earlier decades, the simplicity of a routine offered her something Hollywood never could: a steady pulse, predictable days, and a sense of control over her own movements. She worked in positions that required diligence, but not emotional sacrifice. Clerical work, front desk responsibilities, customer interactions that carried no echo of her former fame. These roles grounded her, drawing her into the present moment in ways that her past life had never allowed. She learned to find comfort not in applause, but in the measured tasks of daily living, the gentle structure that comes from work completed without the scrutiny of the public eye. People who encountered her during these years often described her with quiet admiration. They noted her politeness, her competence, her ability to maintain calm even in stressful situations. Some recognized her, though more as a distant memory than a living myth, while others never knew that the reserved woman who handed them a room key or typed up a report had once stood beneath dazzling studio lights. Frances did not offer this information readily. If someone recognized her, she acknowledged it with a modest nod, then gently redirected the conversation. She no longer sought to define herself through her past. Instead, she seemed to move through life as though shedding layers of identity: star, patient, legend, leaving behind only the essential core of a person who had endured. Yet beneath this quiet surface, her inner world remained rich, contemplative, and at times achingly complex. She lived alone for much of this period, occupying modest apartments where sunlight filtered through thin curtains, and the sounds of neighboring televisions drifted faintly through the walls. She developed a fondness for solitude, not out of isolation, but out of a desire for peace. Solitude gave her space to breathe without fear of misinterpretation, without the burden of performing stability or brilliance for anyone else. She filled her evenings with books, reflections, and occasionally the soft murmur of a radio program that drifted in and out of tune. Her notebooks, though sporadically kept, reveal glimpses of an introspective mind still striving to understand the shape of her life, the meaning of suffering, and the fragile uniqueness of human endurance. In the stillness of these years, memories from her past often rose to the surface, sometimes gently, like leaves drifting down a quiet stream, other times sharply, like fragments of broken glass catching the light unexpectedly. She remembered performances that had once consumed her with fire, remembered the voices of directors who demanded more, always more, remembered the applause that had once thrilled her, but now felt like an echo from another lifetime. But alongside those memories were darker ones: the corridors of institutions, the press cameras that captured her anguish, the arguments with her mother that left wounds neither could fully articulate. These memories did not disappear, but they softened at the edges, blending into a tapestry of a life that had held both beauty and pain in unbalanced measure. Yet if the past visited her, it did not control her. Frances developed an ability to observe her memories without being drawn entirely into their emotion. She became, in some ways, a witness to her own life, viewing it with the reflective distance of someone who had learned the limits of storytelling. She no longer sought to define her experiences as tragedy or injustice or fate. She simply acknowledged them as the truth she had lived, a truth uniquely her own, but not necessarily emblematic of anything larger. She resisted efforts, by writers, filmmakers, or curious acquaintances, to turn her into a symbol. She had lived too long being shaped by others' interpretations to surrender herself to symbolic narratives again. Her social life remained modest but meaningful. She developed a small circle of acquaintances, co-workers, neighbors, a few individuals who appreciated her dry humor and sharp intelligence. She did not seek deep attachments, but neither did she shy away from friendship. Her interactions were gentle, unhurried, often marked by subtle warmth. She was known to offer thoughtful advice, delivered in a tone that carried traces of her former passion, softened by her years of hardship. Those who knew her during this period often remarked that she spoke rarely of her past, but occasionally, almost accidentally, revealed insights that hinted at profound understanding. She did not linger on her pain, and she did not perform her resilience. She simply existed within it. The world around her changed rapidly during these decades. Television replaced radio as the dominant medium, Hollywood evolved into something louder and glossier, and cultural perceptions of mental health slowly began to shift. Yet Frances moved through these transformations with a quiet steadiness. She did not return to public life or seek to correct the narratives that had grown around her. Perhaps she felt no need. Perhaps she believed that any attempt to reshape her story would only invite further distortion. Or perhaps she understood, more deeply than anyone else, that the truth she carried within her did not require validation. There were moments of small beauty in her days, unexpected kindness from a stranger, the warmth of sunlight across her hands as she read in the morning, the comfort of washing dishes in quiet reflection. These simple acts grounded her in a way that fame never had. They offered her a rhythm of life that felt sustainable, honest, and free from the pressure of performance. And though she occasionally stepped onto small stages in local theaters, these performances were gentle echoes of her former self, reflections rather than declarations. They allowed her to hold on to her love for the craft without being consumed by it. During one of these years, she found herself sitting at her kitchen table once more, the same place where the unfinished letter had rested so long ago. The letter still remained, slightly faded, still incomplete. She picked it up, read the few lines she had written, and quietly placed it back on the table without adding a word. The act felt neither sad nor final. It simply was. A testament to the fact that some parts of life do not resolve neatly, some relationships do not reconcile fully, and some stories remain half-told. Later that evening, as the sky darkened and the hum of traffic softened, Frances stepped outside for a short walk. The neighborhood was still, the street lamps casting long beams of amber light across the pavement. She listened to the distant sound of someone laughing, the rustle of leaves along the curb, the faint bark of a dog several houses away. These quiet details formed the landscape of her life now, not grand, not dramatic, but deeply human. As she turned toward home, the film reel of her past flickered briefly in her mind, not as something she wished to relive, but as something she had ultimately survived. Behind her, in the small kitchen she had just left, the unfinished letter remained on the table. The faint outline of her handwriting illuminated by the dim light, a quiet fragment of a life that had learned to accept unresolved endings. The unfinished letter resting on the kitchen table continues to hold its gentle vigil, untouched in the dim light, and as the night settles around it, the world outside her door keeps moving forward without her, leaving Frances in a curious space between presence and disappearance. It is here, in these quiet middle years, that another transformation unfolds, not within Frances herself, but in the world that once claimed to celebrate her. Hollywood, the place that had shaped her rise and witnessed her collapse, moved on with a swiftness that revealed something long understood but seldom spoken. The industry forgets as easily as it embraces, replacing its fallen stars with new faces the way a tide erases footprints in the sand. This forgetting was not dramatic. It did not arrive with announcements or farewells. It came gradually like a fog encroaching upon old memories until the once vivid presence of Frances Farmer on screens and billboards became a faint, distant murmur. In the years after her return to everyday life, Frances became aware of how completely Hollywood had erased her from its active consciousness. Producers who once courted her talent now treated her name as an uncomfortable footnote. Many of the directors she had worked with retired or passed away, their memories fading along with their careers. Younger actors entering the industry had no reason to know who she was. The studio system itself evolved, reshaping its image, discarding the rigid formulas of the past in favor of newer, flashier narratives. The transformations were so swift and sweeping that they left little room for remembering those who had slipped through its machinery, those whose stories held more pain than glamour. Frances watched these changes from a distance, neither yearning to return nor resenting the industry for its indifference. She had understood, even in her youth, that Hollywood did not love individuals. It loved symbols, illusions, projections. Once she no longer served that purpose, once she no longer fit the narratives it needed, she became invisible to it. This invisibility, though painful in its earliest stages, became strangely liberating with time. No longer did she feel the pressure of expectation, the weight of being seen or scrutinized. She walked freely through her days without fearing that her expressions, her gestures, her silences would be interpreted as evidence of instability or defiance. The world that had once touched every corner of her life now passed her by without notice, and in that passing she found a certain peace. But even as Hollywood forgot her, traces of her work lingered quietly in the shadows. Old films of hers occasionally aired on late-night television, often without fanfare or proper introduction. Viewers who stumbled upon her performances in these forgotten hours sometimes felt a strange familiarity, sensing her intensity without knowing her name. Film students digging through archives discovered her roles with surprise, wondering how such a remarkable actress had disappeared so completely from the mainstream conversation. Yet these discoveries remained isolated, like small embers glowing beneath ash, disconnected from the wider narrative of cinema history. Her legacy became scattered. Fragments of celluloid, scattered mentions in outdated magazines, brief footnotes in encyclopedias that summarized her life in a few stark lines. Still, the deeper forgetting was not in her work, but in the misremembering of who she truly was. As the decades passed, the stories about her grew more distorted. New retellings emerged, some casting her as a tragic genius destroyed by an unforgiving industry, others portraying her as a cautionary example of nonconformity, punished by society. Filmmakers dramatized her life with sweeping liberties, presenting scenes that bore little resemblance to reality, but that fit neatly into old cinematic archetypes. The troubled starlet, the rebellious woman crushed by authority, the madness that consumes, the redemption that never arrives. These depictions reached wider audiences than her actual performances had in years, shaping her legacy into something mythic rather than human. Frances, hearing of such portrayals occasionally through acquaintances or by chance, reacted with a quiet ambiguity. She did not correct the stories. She did not embrace them. She did not denounce or defend the versions of herself that others constructed. Perhaps she sensed that the world needed stories more than truths, or perhaps she had grown too weary to engage with the endless cycle of interpretation. She had lived through the distortion of her identity once already. She had no desire to re-enter that arena, where voices clamored to define her, while ignoring the quiet depths of her actual experience. Yet beneath the surface of this forgetting, a quieter, more profound reality emerged. Frances was learning to let go. She no longer clung to the idea of reclaiming her place in the public imagination. The world's silence no longer frightened her. In place of the noise that had once overwhelmed her, she welcomed the gentle rhythm of ordinary life. The hum of a washing machine became more comforting than applause. A morning cup of coffee offered more solace than the approval of strangers. The world, in forgetting her, inadvertently granted her a form of sanctuary. Still, traces of longing lingered in subtle moments. When a film of hers aired unexpectedly and she happened to catch a glimpse of her younger self, she paused, not out of vanity, but out of curiosity. The woman on the screen with her fierce eyes and unfiltered intensity felt both familiar and distant. Frances watched her with the detached interest of someone studying an old photograph, recognizing the person, yet sensing that she no longer inhabited that version of herself. The intensity of her youth seemed almost foreign, a reminder of a self that had carried a fire too bright for the world that tried to contain it. Friends and acquaintances occasionally asked if she missed her former life, her career, the brilliance that had once seemed destined for greatness. Frances never gave a definitive answer. She spoke instead of gratitude for the quiet, for the chance to exist without spectacle. She said that every life takes shapes it cannot predict, and that the measure of a life is not the height of its ascent, but the depth of its understanding. Those who heard her speak this way often left with a sense of having glimpsed something profound, yet elusive, a wisdom born not from triumph, but from surviving the long and difficult journey of being misunderstood. And so the world moved on as it always does, but Frances settled into her place within this quiet forgetting. She lived in small apartments, worked modest jobs, formed gentle acquaintances, and allowed the days to unfold without force. She did not chase after the recognition that had once been thrust upon her. She did not attempt to rewrite her own mythology. She simply existed with a stillness that the younger Frances might never have understood. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and cast a muted glow across the living room where she sat reading, she reached out to switch off the television just as an old film reel flickered into view. Her own face appeared briefly on the screen, young, luminous, filled with the fire that once frightened and inspired those who watched her. Frances paused for a moment, her hand resting on the dial, watching the faint image shimmer like a ghost across time. Then, with a gentle motion, she turned off the set, allowing the room to return to its quiet dusk. In the silence that followed, a forgotten box of film reels sat undisturbed in a storage closet somewhere miles away, its contents gathering dust, its memories waiting patiently in the dark. The forgotten box of film reels sits in that distant closet, its metal edges cool and dust-covered, waiting in the dark like a sealed chamber of memories. And as it rests there, untouched by the hands that once hurried to load its contents into projectors, Frances herself moves quietly through the later years of her life, reflecting not only on what had happened to her, but on what she had chosen to remember, to bury, or to let drift into silence. It is in this slow, introspective chapter that she begins the most delicate work of all, confronting the long corridor of her own memory, a corridor lined with doors she sometimes opens with calm acceptance, sometimes passes by without a glance, and at other times stares at in hesitation, uncertain whether the past behind them will settle gently into view or rise like a storm. In these years, Frances did not speak much publicly, nor did she attempt to correct the distorted versions of her story that circulated around her. Yet in private, and sometimes in the presence of the few who remained close to her, she allowed herself to reflect more openly. She had reached a stage in her life where she could revisit certain memories without being consumed by them, though others still carried a sting that never fully softened. What she remembered, and what she chose not to remember, revealed a woman slowly stitching together a sense of self from fragments that time and suffering had scattered across decades. She recalled at times the early joy of theater, those moments before Hollywood, before pressure, before her name became something used more by others than by herself. She would speak of the first time she felt the thrill of stepping into a character and discovering, through performance, a truth even she had not known she carried. These memories brought light to her eyes, a faint glimmer of the woman she had once been. And yet even here, within these joyful recollections, there was a quiet sadness, as though she understood that the purity of those early years had been irrevocably altered by everything that followed. When she spoke of Hollywood, her tone was neither bitter nor nostalgic. It was measured, reflective, shaped by an awareness that her relationship with the industry had always been complicated. She acknowledged that she had been naive, that she entered the system believing her talent and integrity would be enough. She recognized now that her refusal to mold herself into the expected shape had placed her on a precarious path, yet she did not regret her defiance. Regret, she believed, implied that a different choice would have made her a different person. But she had always been herself, even when the world tried to reconfigure her into something more convenient. Of her institutional years, she spoke little, and when she did, her words were marked by restraint. She described moments of clarity, of small kindnesses, of fleeting connections with other patients who had become companions in suffering, but she also hinted at moments of struggle, of confusion, of a yearning to be heard. She did not offer the dramatic accounts that others later attributed to her life. She did not linger on the darkest rumors or the stories that grew into legend. Instead, she approached those memories like someone holding a fragile object in her hands, handling it with care so it would not shatter again. She seemed to understand that some experiences cannot be put into words without altering them, and some truths are too heavy to uncover repeatedly. In these later years, the people who knew her tended to describe her with a kind of gentle awe. They spoke of her sharp wit, her surprising humor, her unexpected warmth. They were often struck by the contrast between the quiet dignity she carried and the tumultuous stories that circulated about her. It was common for them to say that she seemed wiser than her years, not in the performative sense, but in the quiet clarity of someone who had endured much and emerged with perspective rather than bitterness. They admired the calm with which she approached her life, the way she moved through the world with neither apology nor demand. Frances, for her part, understood that memory itself is sometimes a choice. There were pieces of her past that she embraced for the meaning they still carried, moments when she had felt alive, inspired, deeply connected. There were other moments that she acknowledged without excavating, allowing them to exist in the background like shadows cast by a distant light. And then there were the memories she gently closed the door on, not out of denial, but out of self-preservation. She had learned the cost of dwelling too long in certain corridors of the mind, and she no longer wished to lose herself in those depths. One of the most profound shifts in her later reflections was her understanding of truth. She recognized that people had told many stories about her, some filled with empathy, others with condemnation, many with sensationalism, and she came to see that no single version could encompass the full reality of her life. Truth, for Frances, became something fluid, a spectrum of experiences interpreted differently by each person who encountered her story. She did not feel compelled to correct these interpretations, for she had learned that people often cling to the version of a story that resonates most with their own fears or desires. Instead, she held quietly to her own truth, the one shaped by her lived experiences rather than by the words of others. She also reflected on the idea of forgiveness, whether it was possible, whether it was necessary, whether she herself desired it. She grappled with the actions of those who had harmed her, intentionally or otherwise, and the complex feelings she held toward her mother. The emotional landscape of forgiveness, she realized, was not one of absolution, but of release. It was not about erasing the pain, but about no longer allowing that pain to dictate the contours of her life. In this sense, Frances found a kind of peace, a softening of the sharpest edges, a recognition that human beings often act out of fear, ignorance, or misplaced love rather than cruelty. And with this growing acceptance came a strange and tender realization. She no longer needed the world to understand her. The hunger for understanding, which had once burned within her like a relentless flame, had diminished into something quieter, something more personal. She no longer sought validation from the public, nor did she crave acknowledgement of her suffering. Her peace came not from being seen accurately, but from allowing herself to exist without the burden of explanation. There were nights when she sat alone on her porch, the cool air brushing against her skin, listening to the distant hum of passing cars. She would close her eyes and breathe in the stillness, letting it settle deep within her. And in those quiet moments, she sometimes imagined her past as a collection of fragments scattered across the ground. Bright pieces, dark pieces, shattered pieces, smooth ones, each holding a part of her story, but none containing the whole. She no longer felt the need to gather them. It was enough simply to acknowledge that they were hers. One evening, as she stood in the doorway of her home, reflecting on the years she had lived, she felt a soft breeze carry the scent of night-blooming flowers. She paused, absorbing the calm of the moment, and allowed her thoughts to rest. Somewhere beyond the threshold of her memory, a diary, real or imagined, closed gently, its pages whispering shut in the quiet. The imagined diary closes with a soft whisper, and from that faint settling of pages rises the quiet final movement of Frances Farmer's life. A long stretch of years marked not by spectacle nor by reinvention, but by the slow, steady embers of a life lived in the aftermath of storms. These were her later years, the ones often overlooked, compressed in retellings into brief footnotes, yet filled with a depth of quiet persistence that revealed more about her character than any headline or rumor ever had. It was in this period, when public memory had all but released her and her past had ceased to chase her, that Frances began to inhabit a new relationship with the world, one shaped not by who she had been, but by who she allowed herself to become. She lived simply, without the urgency that had once driven her, without the alertness to judgment that had shadowed her during her Hollywood years. Her home during this time was modest, tucked into a quiet neighborhood where the days drifted by with a soothing regularity. The house had the scent of old books and brewed coffee, and the windows often stood half open, letting the wind move gently through the rooms. Neighbors who saw her described her as polite, serene, and surprisingly unassuming. Few realized they lived beside a woman whose name had once appeared in screaming headlines, whose face had once lit up theater screens. Those who did know rarely mentioned it, sensing perhaps that she preferred it that way. She had built for herself an existence in which she no longer needed to negotiate with the demands of fame or navigate the distortions of public perception. Her daily routine reflected this new equilibrium. Mornings were slow, filled with the gentle sounds of water boiling and pages turning. She took comfort in the small rituals that shaped her days, watering her plants, writing brief notes to herself, organizing drawers in quiet, methodical patterns. Some days she ventured into town, visited shops, or exchanged polite greetings with people who knew her only as the woman with thoughtful eyes and a reserved smile. To them, she was simply Frances, not the fractured legend or tragic icon history had crafted. And perhaps, in those interactions, she found a reflection of the self she had long been searching for. Yet even in these calmer years, the past was never entirely silent. It traveled with her like a subdued shadow, no longer overwhelming, but present enough to settle at the edges of her quieter moments. There were times when she paused mid-task, struck by a memory of a rehearsal room thick with dust and anticipation, of the press of makeup under stage lights, of the sharp click of a camera shutter, capturing a moment she had never wished to freeze. These memories surfaced without bitterness, as though reminding her that she had lived many lives, each carrying its own truth. She no longer tried to push them away. Instead, she acknowledged them gently, allowing them to drift through her mind like distant echoes that no longer required response. In this period, work remained a steady part of her life, though not in the glamorous sense the world once associated with her. She held positions that grounded her in routine and allowed her to contribute without drawing attention. She worked for a time as a hostess in a hotel restaurant, greeting guests with quiet warmth, She took on tasks in local businesses, organizing paperwork, answering phones, offering help with a proud but understated professionalism. Those who worked with her often remarked on her reliability and her ability to bring calm into even the busiest environments. They saw her as someone who listened more than she spoke, someone who carried an air of experience without ever invoking it as authority. Despite her reluctance to revisit the world of performance, she occasionally stepped back into acting in the smallest and gentlest of ways. A local theater production needed someone with stage experience. A friend asked for help with a community project. A small venue offered her a role without expectations or embellishment. Frances accepted these opportunities sparingly, not to chase a former glory, but because something inside her recognized the familiar hum of creativity she had once loved. Her performances during these times were subdued, marked by a maturity that carried the weight of all she had endured. The audiences, small, quiet, attentive, sometimes felt a strange stirring as they watched her. They saw in her movements a reserve shaped not by hesitancy, but by understanding, as though she had learned the subtle art of revealing only what she wished to reveal. When she stepped off the stage, she did so without ceremony, fading back into her quiet life as effortlessly as a shadow blending into dusk. In her interactions with others, she displayed a remarkable ability to separate the present from the past. She rarely complained, rarely spoke of the injustices she had faced, rarely indulged in the bitterness that might have consumed someone with a less resilient spirit. Instead, she seemed to embrace the notion that suffering, while painful, could also cultivate a certain clarity, a deeper awareness of what truly held value in the fragile span of a human life. Conversations with her often drifted toward philosophical reflection. She had read widely, thought deeply, and lived through experiences that forced her to confront the complexities of identity, autonomy, and the unpredictable nature of fate. Those who listened to her found her words touched by a quiet wisdom, a wisdom that did not seek to teach, but simply to express itself gently. Still, loneliness touched her life in ways even she could not completely deny. Though she valued solitude, she was not immune to the ache that emerged in the quiet hours of the night, when the world outside fell still and memories drifted more freely into consciousness. There were moments when she felt the absence of deep companionship, moments when she wondered what her life might have been had she taken a different path or faced different circumstances. Yet she did not dwell long on these thoughts. She had learned too well the danger of sinking into the echoes of what could have been. Instead, she allowed the melancholy to settle beside her like an old companion, neither feared nor despised, simply present. As her later years unfolded, Frances's physical strength began to wane, though her mind remained sharp. She moved more slowly, rested more frequently, and found comfort in familiar surroundings. There were days when she walked through her home touching objects as though greeting old friends, the edge of her bookshelf worn from years of handling, the ceramic cup she favored for tea, the curtain she had sewn herself one quiet afternoon. These small gestures grounded her in a reality she had built with her own hands, a reality far removed from the chaos of her youth. Neighbors occasionally checked in on her, offering assistance with errands or inviting her for meals. She accepted these gestures with gratitude, but maintained her quiet independence. She valued privacy not out of secrecy, but out of choice, a choice she had once been denied too often. And as she aged, she seemed to grow even more comfortable with the gentle invisibility her life had acquired. She no longer felt the tug of longing for recognition, nor the sting of abandonment by the world that once celebrated her. She moved through her days with a kind of tender acceptance, as though each moment, mundane or reflective, held its own quiet significance. One evening, after returning from a short walk, she paused in the doorway of her home, listening to the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of a wall clock, the hush of the room settling into night. She leaned her hand lightly against the door frame, feeling the cool wood beneath her fingers. In that moment, she sensed the gentle truth of her life, not triumphant, not tragic, but enduring. A life shaped by storms yet carried forward by an unspoken resilience. Outside, the wind stirred in the empty parking lot, brushing faint patterns of dust across the pavement as though marking time in slow, quiet strokes. The faint brush of wind across the empty parking lot settles into silence, and from that stillness, the final chapter of Frances Farmer's earthly presence begins to unfold, quietly, gradually, as though her life were dimming like the last ember of a long burning fire. These final days were not marked by dramatic pronouncements or sweeping gestures, but by the soft inevitability that accompanies the closing of a life lived in both turbulence and tranquility. Frances had long since stepped away from the public gaze, and now she stepped gently toward the last threshold of her journey, wrapped in solitude that was neither bitter nor feared, but accepted with the clear-eyed calm of someone who had already weathered every imaginable storm. By the time she reached her final years, her body had grown frail, and even the simple act of walking across her small home required deliberate effort. Yet within that frailty lived a quiet strength, a spirit that had not been extinguished even by decades of misunderstanding and hardship. Neighbors and acquaintances who saw her in these later days often remarked on the dignity she carried, even in her slow movements and soft-spoken answers. She had become a figure of gentle presence, the kind of person whose life no longer needed to be asserted or defended. The world around her had changed many times over, reshaping itself into something almost unrecognizable from the one she had known as a young actress. And Frances moved through it as one of its quieter observers, watching the passing of new generations like someone reading pages from a distant book. Her home had become her sanctuary, a simple dwelling filled with familiar objects that had accumulated meaning over the years. A well-worn armchair by the window, stacks of books with their spines softened from frequent handling, a small radio whose tinny music filled the rooms in the evening. These things formed the landscape of her days, supporting her in ways fame never had. And as her strength waned, she found herself spending more time resting in that armchair, watching the shifting light as the hours passed, listening to the faint sounds of the world outside, a car door closing, the murmur of footsteps along the sidewalk, the distant echo of laughter from a nearby home. These small sounds, once background noise, now held a certain poignancy, reminders that life continued around her even as her own began to slip quietly into its final season. Though she rarely spoke of her past, there were moments when memory visited her with a clarity that startled even her. In those flashes, she recalled the flicker of studio lights, the thrill of early performances, the sting of public scrutiny, the sterile corridors of institutions, the faces of people who had loved her, betrayed her, or simply passed through her life without understanding her. These memories did not arrive with the force they once carried. Instead, they drifted through her mind like gentle tides, soft, slow, and ultimately receding without demanding anything from her. She had, by this stage, developed a kind of truce with her past, recognizing it as part of her, but no longer allowing it to define her. In her quieter hours, she sometimes wondered how she would be remembered, if she would be remembered at all. She knew that the world had woven stories about her, some rooted in truth, others born of myth or sensationalism. She knew that her name occasionally surfaced in articles or whispered conversations, often distorted by the distance of time. Yet she felt strangely detached from these narratives. Legacy, she understood, belonged to the world, not to the individual. It was shaped not by the accuracy of memory, but by the needs and imaginations of those who retold it. And so, she let go of the idea of controlling her story, choosing instead to rest in the quiet certainty of her own lived experience, the only version of her life that truly mattered to her. As her physical strength continued to fade, the world around her took on a softer quality. Colors seemed more muted, sounds more distant, time more fluid. She no longer felt the need to plan for the future or revisit the complexities of the past. Instead, she lived moment to moment, finding comfort in the simple pleasures that remained: a warm cup of tea, the soft fabric of a blanket across her lap, the sight of birds gathering in the empty parking lot outside her window. These gentle scenes offered her a sense of continuity, a reminder that even as her life drew toward its close, the world still held beauty. It was during this final stretch that she received occasional visits from a small handful of people who still cared for her, individuals who had known her not as a legend or an emblem of tragedy, but simply as Frances. They brought her groceries, helped tidy her home, shared brief conversations that drifted between the mundane and the contemplative. These visits did not intrude upon her solitude, but supported it, offering her the reassurance that she was not entirely alone, even in her most fragile moments. To them, she seemed content, though a quiet sadness sometimes flickered behind her eyes, an understanding, perhaps, that her life's most intimate truths had never been fully seen or understood by others. As the days passed, her world grew smaller and smaller until it was contained almost entirely within the quiet boundaries of her home. She slept more, spoke less, and allowed herself to drift through memories with the gentle acceptance of someone walking along a familiar shoreline. Her final nights were calm, marked not by fear or struggle, but by a slow surrender to the natural rhythm of endings. Those who saw her near the end remarked on the serenity of her expression, as though she had already stepped halfway into another realm, unburdened by the turbulence that had once defined her name. When the moment of her passing finally arrived, it came softly, like a candle flame extinguishing not by force, but by the gradual closing of its own light. There was no public announcement, no swarm of reporters, no dramatic circling back to the spectacle that had once overshadowed her life. She left the world as quietly as she had lived in her later years, gently, almost imperceptibly, like a whisper carried off by the wind. After she was gone, her home stood silent for a time, filled with the faint echoes of her presence. A pair of reading glasses rested beside a book she had bookmarked, but not finished. A cup of tea, half empty, lingered on the table. The radio, turned off for days, still held the memory of songs she had listened to in the soft glow of evening. These objects, intimate and unremarkable, bore the imprint of a life that had endured with quiet grace, a life known fully only to herself. Outside, in the empty parking lot, the wind stirred again, brushing across the pavement with a gentle hum. The world moved on, as it always does, but for a moment, the briefest moment, it felt as though something unseen paused to acknowledge the passing of a spirit who had weathered more than anyone could truly understand. The gentle hum over the empty parking lot fades into the evening air, and in that fragile pause, the world begins to speak about Frances Farmer once more, not as she was in life, but as she became in memory. For her passing did not silence her story. Instead, it opened a new and curious chapter in which the world, having forgotten her in her later years, suddenly remembered her again, reaching back into the shadows to pull her name into the glow of curiosity, speculation, and reevaluation. It was a strange afterlife, built not of spirit or legend in the traditional sense, but of narratives crafted by those who had known her only through their own interpretations, desires, and fears. In this aftermath, Frances became something she had never been able to control, a symbol molded by countless hands, a figure invoked to illustrate the costs of fame, the failures of institutions, or the tragedy of nonconformity in a rigid world. In the years following her death, renewed interest in her life sparked through magazines, books, and film retrospectives. Writers rediscovered her performances, noting the startling sincerity in her early roles, her unguarded vulnerability, her defiant gaze. They wrote pieces wondering how such a talent had slipped through the cracks, how an actress who once shone so brightly on stage and screen could vanish into obscurity before the world thought to look for her again. Some spoke with admiration, marveling at her intensity. Others spoke with pity, focusing on her suffering. Rarely did anyone capture the quiet resilience that had defined her final decades. It was easier, it seemed, to frame her story as a tragedy, to cast her as a martyr of Hollywood's cruelty or society's misunderstanding. And so the myths began to bloom again. Tales that had circulated during her lifetime, those whispered exaggerations, those embellished anecdotes, were revived and expanded by storytellers who sought to make her life fit the mold of a cautionary tale. Some described nightmarish scenes in institutions, painting her as a victim of horrific abuses. Others romanticized her defiance, portraying her as a rebellious spirit punished for her refusal to conform. These narratives, though dramatic and compelling, blurred the line between truth and fiction in ways that would have pained her had she still been present to witness them. Yet these were the stories that captured public attention, for they spoke to the darker fantasies people held about the underbelly of fame and the fragility of the human mind. Filmmakers seized upon her story as well, producing dramatizations that blended reality with invention. One such film, years after her death, shaped the public's understanding of her life more powerfully than any archive or interview. It presented her as a shattered woman subjected to unspeakable cruelty, emphasizing the most extreme interpretations of her institutional years while minimizing the complexities of her personality, her intellect, and her agency. Audiences, moved by the emotional intensity of the portrayal, accepted these dramatized events as truth, unaware of how far they deviated from documented reality. The film, like so many stories told after the subject's voice has gone silent, created a version of Frances that was both sympathetic and false, a version easier for the world to understand than the real woman who had lived a life that defied simple categorization. Scholars, too, began to explore her story, often with the intent of rescuing her legacy from sensationalism, though even their efforts were shaped by the difficulty of separating fact from myth. They examined her writings, her interviews, her surviving letters, trying to trace the contours of her inner world through the fragments left behind. Some scholars argued that she had been misunderstood, that her assertiveness and intelligence had been misinterpreted as instability in a time when women were expected to be compliant. Others suggested that her suffering had been genuine, rooted in emotional struggles exacerbated by an industry that offered little space for psychological vulnerability. Still others questioned the institutional reports, searching for clues to what had truly happened behind closed doors. Each interpretation illuminated a different facet of her story, yet none could fully capture the entirety of her experience. Meanwhile, her films gained new life in small revival theaters and late-night screenings. Audiences who watched her performances decades after her career had ended were struck by the freshness of her presence, the raw emotional truth she brought to her roles. Younger viewers, encountering her work for the first time, wondered how an actress of such power had been allowed to fade into obscurity. Film enthusiasts praised her, some calling her ahead of her time, others noting that her performances seemed more modern than the polished theatrics of her contemporaries. These viewers, watching her through the lens of a world more receptive to complexity, sensed the depth she had carried long before it was valued. And yet, even as admiration for her talent grew, so did the distance between Frances the artist and Frances the myth. Her name became shorthand for the tragic star, invoked alongside other Hollywood figures whose lives had veered into darkness. Her image, captured in photographs where her expression often appeared stern or solemn, became a symbol for the dangers of a system that demanded perfection while offering little compassion. Writers and activists used her story to critique the psychiatric practices of the mid-20th century, sometimes accurately, sometimes with embellishment. Each retelling shaped her into something slightly different, a martyr, a rebel, a victim, a warning. But beneath these shifting interpretations lay the complicated truth of her legacy, that she had become a mirror for the anxieties and desires of the world that looked back upon her. People saw in her story what they needed to see: confirmation of their fears about fame, validation of their mistrust in institutions, inspiration for their own struggles against conformity. In this way, her legacy was not fixed, but fluid, changing shape with each generation that rediscovered her. Yet perhaps the most striking aspect of her aftermath was the quiet realization that very few people truly understood the woman behind the myth. Her later years, lived in obscurity and peace, were often overlooked in favor of the more dramatic chapters of her life. The gentle routines she crafted for herself, the small joys she found in ordinary days, the quiet wisdom she carried, all of these were eclipsed by the more sensational parts of her story. And so the world remembered her inaccurately, focusing on the extremes, while overlooking the resilience that had guided her through everything. Still, her legacy offered something meaningful, even if imperfect. It prompted conversations about mental health long before such discussions became common. It encouraged re-evaluations of how society treats those who resist conformity. It reminded viewers of the emotional cost of fame and the fragility of identity under public scrutiny. Even the myths, for all their distortions, revealed truths about the culture that created them. Truths about the fascination with tragedy, the hunger for narratives that simplify complex lives, the difficulty of remembering people in their full humanity. Years after her passing, when her name surfaced in articles or retrospectives, it often carried a note of quiet reverence. People sensed, even through the haze of myth, that she had been a figure of rare depth, someone whose life held more meaning than the world had allowed her to express. And though many versions of her story existed, none could erase the core of who she had been. A brilliant, complicated woman who moved through the world with courage, sensitivity, and a fierce commitment to her own truth. One night, in a small screening room lit only by the soft flicker of a projector, a forgotten film of hers played before a sparse audience. Her image appeared on the glowing screen, eyes clear, voice steady, expression fierce with youthful conviction. The reel clicked softly as it spun, casting its delicate rhythm into the room. And in that dim space, for the span of a few scenes, she lived again, her presence illuminating the darkness, reminding those who watch that even legends shaped by myth can still reveal flashes of truth when the light falls just right. The soft clicking of the projector continues in that dim room, casting shadows that tremble lightly across the walls, and from those trembling shadows emerges the next reflection, one that steps beyond the simple retelling of Frances Farmer's life and into the uneasy territory of legacy. For the story of Frances did not end with her passing, nor even with the renewed interest that followed. Instead, it became something constantly reshaped, questioned, and reinterpreted, as though her memory were made of clay rather than flesh. It is in this lingering space between truth and myth that her legacy settles, a shifting figure that reveals as much about the world that remembers her as it does about the woman herself. History often prefers its figures clearly defined: heroes or victims, rebels or martyrs, geniuses or tragedies. Frances Farmer resisted every such category in life, and she continues to resist them in memory. Yet many attempted to place her neatly within one of these shapes, rearranging her story to serve narratives more digestible than the complicated truth she had lived. Some claimed her as a cautionary tale, a warning about the cost of defying Hollywood's machinery. Others championed her as a feminist icon ahead of her time, a woman whose intellectual independence threatened the fragile structures of her era. Still, others transformed her into a symbol of the failures of psychiatric care, using her name to evoke sympathy or outrage in debates far removed from the nuances of her own experience. Each of these interpretations contains fragments of truth, yet none fully encompasses her. They illuminate aspects, shadows, glimmers of her existence, but they fall short of capturing the entirety of her being. Perhaps this is inevitable, for no life, especially one marked by such intensity and upheaval, can be held wholly in the palm of history. But Frances's story is particularly susceptible to simplification because she lived at the intersection of so many powerful forces: the glamour and cruelty of early Hollywood, the rigid expectations of mid-century womanhood, the flawed psychiatric practices of her time, and the enduring human fascination with narratives of downfall and redemption. Her legacy, then, is a reflection of these tensions. When people speak of Frances Farmer today, they often speak not of the woman who sat quietly reading by her window in her later years, nor of the complexity that shaped her decisions and reactions, but of the mythic figure whose life was flattened into a parable. It is easier to picture her as a blazing star extinguished by cruelty than as a deeply thoughtful woman navigating pressures beyond what most could imagine. It is easier to portray her as a victim stripped of agency than to recognize the ways she pushed back, resisted, and persisted, even when the world tried to reshape her in its image. It is easier to view her story as a tragedy, with sharp lines, rather than a life filled with both sorrow and subtle triumphs, suffering and stubborn hope. Yet a deeper look at her legacy reveals something more intricate than these simplified narratives. For even among the myths, moments of truth shimmer, like faint glints of light within dark water. People sense, even through the distortions, that Frances represents something unsettling yet important, a reminder of how society reacts to those who refuse to conform, how it punishes emotional intensity, how it silences voices that are difficult to categorize. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable aspects of human behavior: our eagerness to judge, our fascination with scandal, our tendency to romanticize suffering rather than understand it. And in this sense, her legacy extends beyond her own life, inviting reflection on the broader systems and social expectations that shaped her fate. Those who knew her personally, even briefly, often pushed back against the myths. They described her not as broken or out of control, but as perceptive, thoughtful, sometimes stubborn, often misunderstood. They spoke of her intelligence, her dry humor, her capacity for introspection. They recalled moments when she showed uncommon kindness or surprising vulnerability. These testimonies, quiet, scattered, and often overshadowed by louder narratives, offer glimpses into the real woman behind the legend. And though they cannot fully reconstruct her truth, they remind us that she was far more than the roles others assigned to her. Her later years, lived far from the public eye, complicate her legacy in ways that invite deeper understanding. She did not spend her final decades in bitterness or chaos, as some dramatizations suggest. She lived steadily, gently, in quiet dignity. She worked, she read, she reflected. She found small pockets of beauty in ordinary life, a life that would have been unrecognizable to those who had once photographed her with relentless flashbulbs. This quiet perseverance, though rarely emphasized in retellings, might be the most significant part of her story. It reveals a resilience that goes beyond survival, a strength not forged through spectacle, but through slow, continuous healing. And so her legacy becomes a constellation of contradictions, a brilliant actress whose talent remains partly hidden behind myth, a misunderstood woman whose complexity defies neat categorization, a figure remembered both too intensely and not accurately enough. Her story asks us to consider how memory works, how it transforms individuals into symbols, how truths are lost when narratives become too rigid or too convenient. It challenges us to resist the urge to reduce a life to a single meaning, urging us instead to sit with ambiguity, to accept that understanding may always remain incomplete. In recent decades, some have sought to reclaim Frances's legacy more thoughtfully, approaching her story with nuance rather than sensationalism. They examine her performances with renewed respect, recognizing the emotional clarity she brought to her roles. They revisit historical documents, questioning earlier assumptions. They write essays and analyses that explore her life not as tragedy alone, but as a journey of profound complexity. These efforts, while imperfect, offer a gentler way of remembering her, one that honors her humanity rather than exploiting her suffering. Yet even these attempts cannot fully disentangle her from the myths that have grown around her. Perhaps in a strange way, this impossibility reflects something essential about her. Frances Farmer was a woman who refused to fit the expectations of her era, and even now, decades after her passing, she refuses to fit neatly into memory. Her legacy remains fluid, shifting, unsettled, resisting categorization just as she did in life. One evening, in a small room lined with shelves of old film canisters and archival papers, a researcher studying her life paused over a photograph taken during her early career. In the image, Frances stands in a quiet corner of a studio lot, her expression neither posed nor performative, but contemplative, as though she were already aware of the contradictions her life would come to embody. The researcher studied the photograph for a long time, sensing something unspoken lingering behind her gaze. And in that still moment, the projector in the next room clicked off, leaving only silence. A silence filled not with certainty, but with possibility. For perhaps this is the truest legacy of Frances Farmer. Not the myths, not the tragedies, not the sensational stories that shaped her public image, but the unresolved space she leaves behind, inviting us to look closer, think deeper, and remember her not as a symbol, but as a human being whose life contained multitudes. As the archive lights dim, the faint hum of the projector recedes into the dark, leaving behind the lingering shadow of a woman who still eludes complete understanding. The faint hum of the projector recedes into the archive's dim quiet, and from that soft withdrawal rises the final movement of Frances Farmer's long, wandering story. A closing reflection that does not attempt to solve her mysteries or pin her life to a single meaning, but instead allows the fullness of her contradictions to settle gently into place. This is not a conclusion built on certainty or resolution, for her life resists such things. Rather, it is a contemplation of what her journey reveals about the fragile cost of being oneself in a world so often uneasy with those who refuse to bend. And as this reflection unfolds, it does so with the slow, contemplative breath of someone standing at the edge of a long path, looking back at the footprints that stretch behind them, faded yet unmistakably their own. When one traces the arc of Frances Farmer's life, from her fierce beginnings in Seattle to the bright promise of Hollywood, through the harsh corridors of institutions, and finally into the quiet hum of her later years, what emerges is not a tale of triumph or defeat, but a mosaic of a complex human spirit, navigating forces too large to control. Hers was a life lived with intensity, with honesty, with a kind of raw emotional clarity that left people fascinated and unsettled in equal measure. And perhaps it is this very intensity, this refusal to soften her edges, that shaped both her rise and her suffering. For Frances moved through the world without the protective layers most people learn to cultivate. She did not hide her intellect behind charm, nor temper her convictions for approval. She carried her inner fire openly, and the world, uncertain how to respond, sometimes drew toward her with admiration and sometimes recoiled with suspicion. In reflecting on her life, one must consider the era she inhabited, a time when Hollywood demanded obedience, when women were expected to be agreeable rather than assertive, when emotional complexity was often dismissed or pathologized. Frances pushed against these expectations not out of rebellion for its own sake, but because her nature would not allow anything less than authenticity. She spoke her mind in interviews, questioned the roles she was given, challenged authority when she felt truth was being compromised. These actions, common and often celebrated today, were seen then as threats to the carefully controlled order of the studio system. Her refusal to conform placed her in collision with a structure that prized predictability, and in this collision she was gradually reshaped, not by her own choosing, but by forces that sought to contain her. Yet it would be reductive to frame her solely as a victim of those forces. Frances was not passive in her fate. She lived with passion, argued fiercely, loved deeply, felt intensely. Her life was not simply something that happened to her. It was something she engaged with fully, even when that engagement led her into painful terrain. She was complicated, flawed, brilliant, stubborn, vulnerable, all the things that make a person vividly human. And though these qualities may have contributed to her suffering, they were also the source of her greatest strength. They allowed her to endure the years of institutionalization with a resilience that surprised even those who believed she had been broken. They allowed her to rebuild a quiet life of dignity in the shadows after the world had turned away. They allowed her to reflect with clarity in her final years, neither clinging to bitterness nor denying the pain she had endured. Her story, then, becomes a meditation on the fragile cost of being oneself in a world that prefers simplicity over complexity. Frances's life reminds us that societies often struggle to hold space for people who do not fit neatly into their categories. Those who feel too much, think too freely, or speak too openly often find themselves at odds with systems designed for compliance rather than authenticity. And while the world may admire such individuals in retrospect, it frequently fails to support them in the moment when their courage is most needed. Frances's journey reveals this tension with quiet poignancy, showing how the very qualities that made her exceptional also made her vulnerable in a world unprepared to understand her. Yet her life also speaks to the quiet forms of courage that often go unnoticed. The courage to rebuild after being broken, the courage to live without seeking validation, the courage to forgive without forgetting, the courage to exist gently after surviving violence, misunderstanding, and abandonment. These acts of resilience are not dramatic, and perhaps that is why they are so rarely acknowledged, but they form the backbone of Frances Farmer's later life, shaping a final chapter marked by steadiness and introspection rather than bitterness. It is in these small, quiet acts that one finds the deepest truth of her story, a truth that lingers long after the myths have been questioned and the legends have been stripped away. The meaning of her life, then, is not found in the scandals that surrounded her, nor in the exaggerated tales that overshadowed her name, nor even in the brilliance of her performances, striking as they were. The meaning of her life lies in the space between these things, in the choices she made, the burdens she carried, the resilience she demonstrated, and the quiet dignity with which she lived her later years. It lies in the recognition that a life can be extraordinary without being victorious, profound without being perfect, unforgettable without being fully understood. For those who look back on her story today, Frances becomes more than a cautionary figure or a tragic symbol. She becomes a mirror, inviting reflection on the ways we respond to those who live honestly, passionately, and sometimes painfully. She becomes a reminder that every life contains depths we cannot see, that suffering often coexists with strength, that quiet endurance can be as heroic as dramatic resistance. And she becomes, perhaps most significantly, a gentle warning that truth, individuality, and emotional authenticity come with costs, and that societies must learn to support rather than silence those who carry such qualities. In this final contemplation, one might imagine Frances standing at the edge of her story, not as a broken figure nor as a mythic phoenix risen from ashes, but as a woman who lived, struggled, endured, and finally rested, a woman whose truth refused to be erased even when the world tried to rewrite her, a woman whose memory lingers not because of glamour or scandal, but because of the quiet humanity that flows through every chapter of her life. And so, as this long reflection draws to a close, one last image settles softly into view. Frances walking slowly through a field at dusk, the sky washed with fading gold, the wind brushing past her gently as though recognizing her spirit. She pauses, breathes in the evening air, and looks toward the horizon, not seeking answers, not yearning for resolution, but simply standing in the moment as herself. The light around her dims. The field grows quiet, and the world settles into a silence that feels less like an ending and more like a soft release. Somewhere in that deepening twilight, an unresolved whisper rises, not of mystery nor of tragedy, but of the lingering truth that some lives cannot be neatly understood, only honored.